The motel clerk said, "Welcome back." I had never been there before, but someone checked in with my name the night before. There's a specific kind of loneliness that only exists on long drives. Not bad loneliness necessarily, just that particular sensation of being completely unlocated, of existing outside your regular life, of being nobody to anyone in any direction for 100 miles. I'd grown to like it those first 4 days out of Philadelphia, the highway just pulling me forward, the world narrowing to headlights and radio static, and the occasional chain restaurant sign glowing orange in the dark. I was somewhere in central Missouri when I stopped for the night. October 14th, a Tuesday, around 10 p.m. The motel was called the Plainfield Inn, which told you everything you needed to know about it. 2-story exterior corridor, vending machine outside the ice room, a parking lot that was mostly empty except for a couple of long-haul trucks idling at the far end. The kind of place you pick because it's there and you're tired and $28 cheaper than the Hampton Inn 3 exits back. I was 7 days into driving cross-country alone. Philadelphia to Portland, no fixed itinerary, no deadline. I'd been laid off from my marketing job in September, and instead of immediately starting over, I'd done something that felt either brave or stupid depending on who you asked. Packed the car, pointed it west, started posting the drive on Instagram. Sunrises over truck stops, diner coffee in paper cups, highway overpasses in the golden hour. My followers seemed to like it. I'd picked up a few hundred new ones just in the first week, strangers who started commenting like they were following along with something, which, I suppose, they were. I grabbed my bag from the back seat, zipped my jacket against the cold, and walked into the front office. Fluorescent lights, a laminate counter, a rack of local attraction pamphlets nobody had touched in years. The clerk was a woman somewhere in her 60s, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, not unfriendly. She looked up when I came in. "Checking in," I said. "Name?" "Marsh, Joel Marsh." She typed it in, looked at the screen, and then she looked up at me with a small warm smile, the automatic smile of someone performing a familiar pleasantry, and said, "Welcome back." I stopped. "Sorry?" "Welcome back." She said it again, easy and certain, and then went back to typing. "I've never been here before," I said. She paused, looked at the screen again, then back at me. The warm expression didn't disappear exactly. It just recalibrated, rearranged itself into something more careful. "You're Joel Marsh?" "Yes." She turned the monitor toward me slightly, the way people do when they're about to show you something they're not sure how to explain. On the screen, I could see a reservation record, and at the top of it, clearly, was my name. Joel Marsh. One night. Checked in the previous evening, October 13th, and checked out that morning at 6 a.m. I stared at it. "That's not me," I said. "I wasn't here last night. I was in Columbia. I stayed at a place off Route 70. She took her glasses off her forehead and put them on properly. Looked at the record more closely. "Same name," she said, almost to herself. Then, "Same vehicle make, too. Dark blue Honda." I felt the first cold thing move through me. Not panic, not yet. Just a sudden, prickling wrongness at the back of my neck. My car was a dark blue Honda. A 2019 Civic, nothing distinctive. The kind of car you see 30 of every day. Plenty of dark blue Hondas on any given road. That meant nothing. I told myself that twice. She was apologetic and mildly flustered, the way people get when a situation slides outside their usual script. She gave me a different room from the one the previous guest had used, upgraded me to a first-floor corner unit without charging extra. I thanked her and said it was probably just a coincidence. Someone with the same name, same type of car, just one of those strange things. She agreed readily, the way people do when they want a situation to resolve itself. I carried my bag down the exterior corridor to room 108, the rain just starting, a thin, cold drizzle that made the parking lot lights blur and smear. I unlocked the door, hit the light switch, dropped my bag on the luggage rack. The room was clean, recently cleaned from the smell of it, that specific chemical lavender of budget motel housekeeping. Everything in its place, bed tight, towels folded, little wrapped soap on the bathroom sink. I stood in the middle of the room and looked around the way you look around a room when you don't know what you're looking for, but some part of you is looking anyway. I took out my phone and opened Instagram, found my own account, scrolled back through the last week of posts, Philadelphia in the rear view on day 1, a truck stop breakfast in Ohio, the Arch in St. Louis, shot from the car window as I passed. And yesterday, I scrolled to yesterday's post, a gas station photo taken mid-afternoon, a long, flat Missouri highway behind me, golden and empty. I'd captioned it Day 7, heading west, nowhere in particular. Posted publicly, location tagged. The rain picked up outside, drumming against the window in steady sheets. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and I looked at that post for a long time, and I tried very hard to remember why that should make me feel fine. It didn't work. I slept badly and woke up at 5 a.m. with the room still dark and the rain still going and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from sleeping just enough to feel worse. I lay there for a while, running it back through my head in the sober gray of early morning. Someone named Joel Marsh had checked into this same motel the night before, driving a dark blue Honda. One night, no extensions, out by 6 a.m. It was a common enough name. I'd met 2 other Joel Marshes in my life, one in high school and one through work, and there were presumably dozens more scattered across the country. The car was even less meaningful. Dark blue Civics were everywhere. The overlap was strange, yes, but strange things happened. Coincidences existed. The world was full of them, and most of them meant nothing. I packed up, got back on the highway, and tried to leave it in Missouri. I made it to Kansas by noon and stopped for gas at a station outside a town called Salina. Filled the tank, bought bad coffee and a breakfast sandwich I ate standing against the car because the wind was too sharp to sit outside properly. I posted a photo, the flat Kansas landscape stretching out behind the gas pumps, that enormous Midwestern sky, and got back in the car. The comments came in the way they always did, small, friendly, the language of people who felt like they were traveling with me. Love this series. Keep going. Kansas is so underrated. What's next? I read them at a red light outside of town and felt the usual mild warmth of it, the small reassurance of being seen. There was one comment that was different. Username was a string of numbers and letters, the kind of handle that looks auto-generated, no profile photo, no posts. The comment just said, "The Plainfield Inn." Did you sleep well? I read it 3 times, posted 11 minutes ago. My Kansas post had been up for maybe 30 minutes at that point. I went to the profile, empty, created recently, following only my account. Nothing else. I screenshot it, sat with my thumb over the reply button for a long moment, and then didn't reply. Closed the app, put the phone face down on the passenger seat. The light turned green. I drove. I told myself, and I was almost convincing, that it was just someone being weird online. This happened. You post publicly, you invite the full range of the public, and some fraction of that range is odd or unpleasant or trying to provoke a reaction. The comment wasn't threatening, it wasn't explicit, it was just a sentence, a question, an attempt to unsettle me that I didn't have to let work. Except they knew where I'd stayed. They'd named the motel specifically, which meant either they'd seen something in my posts that I hadn't realized gave it away. A reflection, a background detail, something I'd tagged without thinking, or they'd been there, in person. At the Plainfield Inn on the night of October 13th. I pulled over at a rest stop outside of Ellsworth and went back through my last 3 days of posts with the kind of attention I hadn't given them before, looking for anything that might identify the motel. There was nothing. No signage, no location pin, I'd been deliberately vague about specific stops because I liked the aesthetic of the open road posts without the clutter of geotags. Whatever had told this person where I was sleeping, it hadn't come from the photographs. I checked the account again, still empty. The comment was still there. I deleted the comment and blocked the account and sat in the rest stop parking lot for a while, listening to the wind move across the grass, and told myself that was the end of it. Block and move on. Don't feed it. Don't look for meaning in the behavior of strangers on the internet who have nothing better to do than try to make someone feel watched. The problem was that someone had been watching. The Plainfield Inn comment was too specific for coincidence or guesswork. Someone had been at that motel, had used my name, had driven a car that matched mine, and now had found my Instagram and left me a message that made no effort to explain any of it. Just the question, did you sleep well? I got a hotel that night instead of a motel, a mid-range chain in Hays, Kansas, the kind with a lobby and a keycard system and other guests on every floor. Paid more than I wanted to. Ate dinner in my room and spent too long on my laptop trying to find any record of another Joel Marsh doing anything remotely cross-country in October, which produced nothing useful and took 2 hours. Before I slept, I went back to Instagram and set my account to private. The next morning there were 4 follow requests waiting. 3 were normal, usernames I half recognized from the comment section, real people with real profiles and post histories. The 4th was another string of numbers, different account from the first one, no photo, no posts, created in the last 24 hours, following only me. I declined it, reported it, and went down to the hotel breakfast, feeling like something had shifted in the quality of the air around me. Nothing I could point to, nothing I could explain to another person without sounding like I'd been alone in a car too long. Just the feeling, quiet and persistent and getting harder to argue with, that somewhere behind me on this long open road, something had turned around and started coming my way. I called my friend Marcus from the hotel parking lot before I got back on the highway. Marcus, who I'd worked with at the marketing firm, who had a steady, practical mind and the useful ability to tell me when I was being irrational without making me feel stupid for it. I told him everything, the clerk, the name in the system, the comment, the new accounts. He listened without interrupting, which was how I knew he was taking it seriously. Turn your location services completely off, he said. Not just the app, your phone, all of it. I did it while we were still on the call. Stop posting for a few days, he said. Don't tell anyone where you're stopping. I know. I mean it, Joel. Don't post anything with a background that identifies where you are. No storefronts, no highway signs, no nothing. I told him I understood. We talked for a few more minutes and he offered to come out and drive with me for the last stretch. And I told him that wasn't necessary, that I was being watched by some weird internet person and not actually in danger. He said okay, but called it a possibility rather than a certainty, which I appreciated. I drove for 6 hours and didn't post anything. The silence of the account felt strange. I'd been posting daily for a week, had built something like a rhythm with it, and the absence created a low-level anxiety that I couldn't fully separate from the larger anxiety already sitting in my chest. By late afternoon, I was somewhere in eastern Colorado, the mountains beginning to suggest themselves on the horizon, and the landscape was so staggering that I pulled over twice just to look at it, and both times took photos I didn't post. I stopped in a town called Hugo for gas. Standing at the pump, I checked my email out of habit and found something that made me go very still. It was a booking confirmation from a motel in Denver, reservation for one night, October 16th, which was tomorrow. Name on the booking, Joel Marsh. I hadn't made any reservation in Denver. I hadn't made any reservations at all for the rest of the trip. I'd been booking same day the entire way. The confirmation had been sent to my email address. My actual email address, not a similar one, not a variation. Mine, exactly. I read it 3 times to make sure I was reading it correctly. Then I went to the motel's website and found the contact number and called them. A man answered. I asked if there was a reservation under Joel Marsh for the following night. He confirmed there was. I asked who had made it. He said he couldn't give out that information. I asked if I could cancel it. He asked if I had the confirmation number. I read it to him from the email. He canceled it, cheerful and efficient, clearly unaware of anything unusual. I stood at the gas pump in Hugo, Colorado, with the phone in my hand, and thought about what it meant to receive a booking confirmation for a reservation I hadn't made, sent to an email address I'd never publicly posted anywhere. My email wasn't on my Instagram, wasn't on any social media, wasn't on any public-facing profile I could think of. It was in my work accounts, some subscriptions, my bank, the ordinary private infrastructure of a life. Getting it required either a data breach of something I was subscribed to or a level of targeted searching I didn't want to think too carefully about. Whoever this was, they weren't just watching the Instagram account. They'd been digging. I got back in the car and didn't go to Denver. Took a different highway north instead, toward Fort Collins. Stopped at the first decent-looking motel I found and paid cash, something I'd never done before and had to go to an ATM to manage. Gave my name at the desk and watched the clerk's face when I said it, looking for any flicker of recognition, any echo of what had happened in Missouri. Nothing. Just a normal check-in. Room 14, second floor, facing the parking lot. I sat on the bed and looked at the door for a while. Chain locked, deadbolt thrown, the small inadequacy of motel security that I'd never thought twice about before this week and now couldn't stop thinking about. The window was at street level. I was on the second floor, but the exterior corridor meant anyone could walk past. I pulled the curtain across fully and then stood beside it and looked through the thin gap at the parking lot below. My car was down there. Dark blue Honda, same as always. I counted 3 other dark-colored sedans in the lot. Any of them could be a Honda. In the dark and the rain that had started up again, soft and relentless, I couldn't tell from up here. I stood at the gap in the curtain for longer than I should have, watching the lot, watching the road beyond it, watching the thin stream of headlights moving through the wet dark, looking for something that was my car's shape and color, moving slowly, maybe stopping. Nothing came. I went to bed at 9 and lay there listening to the rain and thought about the version of this trip I'd imagined when I left Philadelphia. The freedom of it, the anonymity, the open road, and no obligations, and nobody knowing exactly where I was. That had felt like the whole point, the not being findable of it, the clean slate of just driving. I understood now that I had never been anonymous. I'd been documented, post by post, stop by stop, a trail of photographs and location data and public timestamps that anyone paying close attention could follow like a string through a maze. I'd thought I was disappearing into America. I'd been drawing a map. My phone lit up on the nightstand. A text from a number I didn't recognize. Denver's nice this time of year. Sorry you couldn't make it. I called Marcus back at 9:14 p.m. and read him the text, and the line that followed it was dead silence for long enough that I checked if the call had dropped. "Don't text back," he said finally. "Don't call that number. Don't acknowledge it at all." I know. Joel. His voice had changed. The practical steadiness still there, but something behind it now, something I recognized as controlled alarm. "You need to call the police." I already had my laptop open, already halfway through composing a non-reply in my head, already running the same argument I'd been running for 3 days, that nothing technically had happened, that I hadn't been touched, that a weird motel coincidence and some online accounts and a text weren't a police matter. Marcus walked me through why I was wrong about that. Impersonation, he said. Filing a false reservation under someone else's name. Harassment, potentially. There was a record now. The motel bookings, the email confirmation, the text. I had evidence. He told me to screenshot everything before I did anything else. I did. 23 screenshots by the time I was done, organized into a folder. Then I called the local non-emergency line and spent 45 minutes on the phone with a dispatcher who was patient but honest. Cross-state digital harassment was complicated, she said. Jurisdictional issues. She took the report, gave me a case number, told me to contact the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center if the contact continued. She recommended I also contact my phone carrier to see if the originating number could be traced. I did all of it. Sat on the edge of that motel bed in Fort Collins until past midnight, filing reports, filling out online forms, calling my carrier. The carrier told me the number was a prepaid burner, unregistered. The IC3 form asked for detailed documentation, which I provided. The local case number sat in my notes app and made me feel like I'd done something useful without actually making me feel safer. Outside, the rain kept falling. I'd stopped noticing it as a comfort by then. It just meant bad visibility. It just meant I couldn't see clearly into the parking lot. I didn't sleep much. What sleep I got was shallow and wrong, the kind where you're never fully under, where every sound in the building reaches you at half volume and your brain keeps making small, urgent decisions about whether each one matters. A door closing, someone's TV through the wall, a car in the lot at 2 a.m., and I was at the window before I was fully awake, standing in the dark with the curtain pulled 2 inches back, watching a man in a heavy jacket walk from a silver truck to the stairwell without looking up. Not looking up. I told myself that was the detail that mattered. He didn't look up, and went back to bed. I was on the road by 7. Marcus had offered again to fly out, and I'd said no again, but I pushed the target. Stopped telling myself Portland by end of week and just said, Portland. That's the only stop that matters. Get there. I drove with my phone face down and the radio on and watched my mirrors more than I had any other day of the trip. Every dark sedan behind me on the highway got a few seconds of my attention before I let it go. There were a lot of dark sedans. There were a lot of Hondas. I started categorizing them. Blue ones, specifically, watching to see which ones stayed with me through lane changes, through exits, through the long, empty stretches of I-25 heading north into Wyoming. None of them stayed, or if one did, I couldn't prove it. I stopped for lunch at a diner in Cheyenne and sat with my back to the wall, which I'd never done before in my life, and which felt both necessary and faintly absurd. Scanned the room when I came in, just a diner, just the ordinary midday cross-section of a Wyoming town, truckers and families and a man at the counter reading a newspaper. Nothing. Paid in cash. Got back on the road. I was outside of Casper, late afternoon, sky going orange and purple ahead of me. The kind of sky that would have had me pulling over a week ago to photograph it, when my phone rang. Unknown number. Different, unknown number from the text, but still unrecognized. I let it ring. Voicemail picked up. I waited 10 minutes and then played the message. Silence for the first few seconds. Then, clearly, the sound of a car interior. Road noise, the low ambient hum of a vehicle in motion, tires on asphalt, wind, and then nothing else. 11 seconds of that, and the call ended. Someone had called me from a moving car and said nothing. I pulled over on the highway shoulder and sat there with the hazards blinking and thought about what that meant. Not a threat, no words, nothing actionable, just presence, just the sound of someone in a car on a road wanting me to know it, wanting me to sit here on the shoulder and wonder how far behind me they were, or whether they were behind me at all, or whether they were already ahead. I called Marcus and played him the voicemail over the phone. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Drive straight to Portland. No stops you don't absolutely have to make. Only chain hotels, only ones with interior corridors and lobby check-ins. Pay cash, give them your name, I don't care. Just get off the empty roads." I didn't argue. I drove until nearly midnight, stopping only once for gas, and checked into a Marriott in Boise, Idaho. Interior corridors, lobby desk, 3 other guests visible in the elevator. I locked the door, put the chain across, and lay on the bed fully dressed with my phone on my chest. The call log was still open. That unknown number sitting at the top of it. I pressed the details, looked at the timestamp, the duration, 11 seconds, and then I noticed the area code. It was a Philadelphia area code. Whoever was behind this hadn't started following me when I left Missouri, hadn't found me through Instagram somewhere in Kansas. The Philadelphia area code meant they knew me before the trip, knew me from home, had my number already, the real one, not scraped from somewhere public, because at some point in my real life, in the city I'd just left, I had given it to them. I knew someone who was doing this. I just didn't know who. The rain started again outside, soft against the Boise night, and I stared at the ceiling and went through every person I could think of. The job, the old apartment building, the coffee shop I went to every morning for 2 years, Marcus, the people at Marcus's birthday party, the woman I'd dated briefly in the spring and ended things with, her friends, her friends' friends, running every face I could summon through the filter of what I now knew. Someone patient, someone methodical, someone who could look me in the eye and nod hello and carry this behind their expression like it weighed nothing at all. I went through every name I had, all night. I couldn't stop. I got to Portland on a Friday afternoon, October 18th, 4 days ahead of what I'd originally planned, and about a decade older than I'd felt when I left Philadelphia. Marcus had a friend there, a woman named Terry, who had a spare room in a house in the Alberta Arts District and had agreed, through a series of texts I wasn't fully conscious of sending, to let me stay for a while. I hadn't told anyone else where I was going. Not my family, not anyone from the old job, not the handful of people I'd texted updates to earlier in the trip. I parked the car in Terry's driveway, carried my bag inside, and sat down at her kitchen table while she made coffee and didn't ask me too many questions. I was grateful for that. No texts came that night, no unknown calls, no follow requests, no comments, no motel confirmations arriving in my inbox. The silence was enormous, and I didn't trust a single second of it. The investigation, if you can call it that at the scale it operated, moved slowly and produced partial answers. The detective in Fort Collins who'd taken my report connected eventually with someone in Philadelphia, and there were interviews I wasn't present for, records subpoenaed from the phone carrier and the motel booking platforms. It took 11 weeks to get anything concrete. I was still in Portland when it finally came. His name was Derek Falk, 29 years old, lived in Fishtown, worked remotely for a software company. I didn't recognize the name at first. Then the detective described him, height, coloring, the fact that he'd mentioned knowing me through a mutual acquaintance, and something small and cold clicked into place. Marcus's birthday party, June. A guy who'd been there with someone else's friend group who I'd talked to for maybe 15 minutes near the kitchen, who'd asked about my job and seemed friendly enough, who I'd given my number to because he'd said something about knowing a marketing contact who might be useful, and I'd said, sure, yeah, send me their details. He never did. I'd forgotten about it within a week. He hadn't. In the months between June and October, he'd found my Instagram, built a working understanding of my routines, and, the detail that still makes something in me go quiet when I think about it, had been planning around the trip from the moment I announced it. He'd followed the account in real time, had driven parallel to me across the country, staying roughly a day behind, booking himself into motels under my name the night before I arrived at each one. Not every stop, just enough. Just enough to know that when I eventually showed up and heard the words "welcome back," it would land like a stone in still water and spread. He wanted me to know I was being followed without being able to prove it. Wanted to occupy that specific gray space where nothing is quite actionable, where you sound paranoid if you explain it to someone who wasn't there for all of it. He'd been there, the Plainfield Inn, the parking lot in Salina where I'd gotten gas, possibly outside the hotel in Hayes. The detective couldn't confirm all of it, but didn't rule it out either. The voicemail from the car was made from I-80 in Wyoming. He'd been maybe 40 minutes behind me. The charges were stalking, criminal impersonation, and harassment. He didn't contest them. His lawyer argued for leniency based on no prior record and what was described in court documents I later read as an intense but non-violent fixation. I wasn't in the courtroom. I couldn't have sat there and watched him explain it. What I know is that he received a suspended sentence, a restraining order, and mandatory counseling. And I know how I feel about that, and I've worked hard to put it somewhere it doesn't swallow everything else. I didn't go back to Philadelphia, sublet the apartment remotely, had someone pack my remaining things into boxes, sold most of it. Portland wasn't supposed to be permanent, but it became permanent the way things do when you stop being able to picture going back. Terry is one of my closest friends now. I found work. I built something new, which is what I seem to do. I still drive. Not long haul, not cross country, but I still take the car out on weekend mornings and find empty roads and feel that specific quiet that comes from moving through places where nobody knows your name. I just don't tell anyone about it anymore. My Instagram has been private since Kansas. I post maybe twice a month. Nothing with locations, nothing with recognizable backgrounds, nothing that documents where I am in anything close to real time. My new followers are only people I know. Some nights I think about the clerk at the Plainfield Inn. Her smile when she said it, automatic and warm. The hospitality reflex of someone who's said welcome back 1,000 times without it meaning anything at all. She had no idea what she was handing me when she said those 2 words. A thread to pull, a wrongness to sit with, the beginning of a week that changed the way I understand my own life. I'm glad she said it. I mean that. Because the alternative, if he'd been more careful, if he'd used a different name, if I'd arrived and felt nothing and driven on. I don't let myself finish that thought very often, but when I do, it goes somewhere dark. You think disappearing is about leaving, about pointing yourself at the horizon and driving until nobody knows where you are. But you carry your name with you. You carry your phone number and your email address and your face and every room you've ever stood in and smiled at a stranger. You carry all of it, every mile. And some people, it turns out, are very good at finding what you carry. Trust the wrongness when you feel it. I was right to pull that thread. I just wish I hadn't had so far to drive before I understood why. The 911 operator told me to stay calm, then whispered, "He's still in the house." I was already on the phone with her when it happened, hiding in the upstairs bathroom, door locked, back pressed against the wall beside the vanity, knees pulled to my chest on the cold tile floor. The light was off. I hadn't turned it on. Some instinct I didn't examine had kept my hand away from the switch, kept me low and dark and still in the way that the body sometimes knows to be, before the brain catches up with why. The 911 operator's name was Diane. She'd told me that in the first 30 seconds, her voice low and even and professionally calm, the voice of someone trained to be the steadiest thing in a room full of panic. She'd already confirmed my address, already told me units were on the way, already walked me through the breathing the way they do. Slow in, slow out, stay with me, you're doing great. I was doing the breathing. I was gripping the phone hard enough that my fingers had gone numb and doing the breathing and listening to the house below me the way you listen when every sound has suddenly become a question. "Can you still hear movement?" Diane asked. "I don't know," I whispered. "Maybe. I'm not sure." "Okay, that's okay. Keep your voice low and stay where you are. Officers are approximately 4 minutes out." 4 minutes. I held that number in my chest like something physical, like if I could just keep it there and breathe around it, everything would stay contained. 4 minutes. I could do 4 minutes. I was already doing it. Then Diane's voice changed. Not much. Barely at all. A shift so subtle I almost missed it completely. The professional calm didn't leave exactly, but something underneath it tightened, a quality that hadn't been there a moment before. And when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something I can only describe as deliberate. Quiet in a way that was different from keeping things low. A whisper. "Carmen. My name, not the address, not ma'am. My name." I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not make any sounds. Do you understand? My stomach dropped through the floor. Yes, I mouthed, almost no sound at all. He's still in the house. 3 seconds of silence. Units are 2 minutes out. Do not move. Do not unlock the door. Do not respond to any sounds you hear. Stay exactly where you are. I stopped breathing, not on purpose. My body simply stopped, the way it does when something has crossed a threshold that breathing seems irrelevant to. I sat on the cold tile in the dark, and I held the phone against my ear and I listened to the house on the other side of the locked bathroom door. And I understood, with a clarity that I have never felt before or since, that there was someone on the other side of it, somewhere in that house, moving or not moving, knowing or not knowing exactly where I was. 2 minutes had never been so long in my entire life. I need to explain how I got there, because context matters, and because none of this started the way you'd think. My parents' house was a 4-bedroom in a suburb I'd grown up in and moved away from at 18, and returned to only for holidays and the occasional long weekend. Solid neighborhood, quiet street. The kind of block where people put American flags out on the 4th of July and knew each other by first name. My parents had lived there for 22 years. Nothing bad had ever happened on that street, at least nothing I knew about. It was the kind of neighborhood whose entire identity was built on the premise that nothing bad happened there. My name is Carmen. I was 29. I'd been staying at the house for 4 days while my parents were in Portugal for their anniversary. 2.5 weeks, their first real trip in years, the kind they'd been talking about since before I went to college. I'd offered to house sit without being asked. I liked the quiet of it, the specific comfort of a house I'd grown up in, the way it held a version of my life that my apartment in the city didn't have room for. The first 3 nights were fine. Better than fine. I slept deeply, worked from the kitchen table during the days, took long walks in the evenings through a neighborhood that was exactly as quiet and unchanged as I remembered it. I talked to my mom twice on the phone and my dad once and told them everything was great, which it was. The 4th night, I went to bed around 11 and woke up at 1:38 a.m. to the sound of the back door. Not the bell, not a knock. The specific, weighted sound of a door being opened slowly. The soft pop of the seal releasing, the low groan the hinges made on the back door specifically, which I knew because I'd heard it 10,000 times growing up, and the sound had lived in me ever since. Unmistakable, distinctive, not a dream. I was out of bed before I was fully awake, phone in hand, and I made it to the bathroom and locked the door, and was already dialing before I'd fully processed the chain of decisions that had gotten me there. Some part of my brain had simply taken over and done the necessary things while the rest of me caught up. That was how I ended up on the floor in the dark, with Diane's voice in my ear, and 4 minutes becoming 2 minutes, becoming the longest stretch of time I have ever lived through. The police arrived at 1:44 a.m. I know because I looked at my phone the moment I heard them. 2 cars, the red and blue light strobing through the gap under the bathroom door, voices in the front yard, then inside the house. Diane telling me I could hear them coming and to call out when they were close enough. I heard them on the stairs. I called out. A male voice responded with my name and a badge number and told me to stay behind the door until he identified himself through the keyhole, which he did, and I unlocked the door and he was standing there in the hallway in full uniform, looking very solid and very real, and I have never been so relieved to see a stranger in my life. They searched the house, top to bottom. Took 20 minutes, 2 officers inside, and 1 in the yard covering the perimeter. They found no one. The back door, which I had locked before going to bed, I was certain of it. I checked it twice, the same way I always did in a house that wasn't quite mine, was unlocked. Not open. Just unlocked. The deadbolt in the unengaged position, the way it would be if someone had come in and then gone back out and pulled it shut behind them. Or if I'd forgotten to lock it. The officer, young, professional, not unkind, asked me whether I might have left it unlocked by accident. I told him no. He wrote something down. He told me they'd patrol the street for the rest of the night, that I was welcome to call back if I heard anything further, and that I should try to get some rest. I stood in the kitchen after they left and looked at the back door and looked at the lock and turned it with my own hand just to feel the action of it. The solid, deliberate click it made engaging, a sound that required intention to produce. That door did not unlock itself. And then I looked at the kitchen table, the one I'd been working from all week, where my laptop sat open from that evening, where my coffee mug from before bed was still sitting on its coaster exactly where I'd left it. Except the chair was wrong. It was facing the hallway, not the way I'd left it, pushed in at an angle toward the table, but pulled out and turned slightly, as though someone had sat in it and looked toward the hallway stairs, toward the upper floor, toward the room where I'd been sleeping. I stood very still and looked at that chair for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Diane back. She wasn't available. Of course she wasn't. Dispatchers work a console, not a direct line, and calling 911 back put me through to a different voice entirely. A man this time, patient, thorough, who took down everything I said about the chair and typed it into whatever system they used and told me he was flagging it for the officers already on patrol in my area. He asked if I felt safe enough to stay in the house tonight. I looked at the back door I'd just relocked, at the chair I hadn't touched and didn't intend to, at the ceiling above me where the hallway light was still on from when the officers had come through. I told him I'd be fine. That was not entirely true, but the alternative, calling my parents in Portugal at 2 a.m. to tell them their house-sitting daughter had possibly had an intruder and definitely couldn't hold it together, felt worse. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with every light in the house on and my back against the armrest facing the doorway, and I watched the dark rectangle of the hall and waited for morning the way you wait for something you're not entirely sure is coming. Morning came. I was still on the couch. The house was exactly as I'd left it. I called my friend Trish at 7 a.m. and told her the whole thing. The sound of the door, the bathroom floor, Diane's whisper, the chair. Trish was quiet through most of it, and then she asked the question I'd been turning over all night. How did the operator know he was still in the house? I didn't have an answer. I'd asked myself the same thing somewhere around 4 a.m., sitting alone in all those lights, and I'd constructed a few possibilities. A second caller had reported something. A patrol unit had spotted someone. Some piece of information had come through the dispatch system that Diane had been acting on. Any of those was plausible. None of them were something I could confirm from the bathroom floor in the dark at 1:40 in the morning. Trish said she'd come over. I told her I was okay. She came anyway, which was the right decision. And by 10 a.m., we were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, and I watched her look at the chair, still turned toward the hallway where I'd found it, still untouched, and watched her face go through the same sequence mine had the night before. "You're sure that's not how you left it?" she said. Not a question. "I'm sure." She looked at it for another moment. Then she got up and pushed it back in at the correct angle without saying anything, and I was grateful for that, for removing it from the room without making a thing of it, because I'd been aware of it at the edge of my vision all morning in a way that was starting to make the kitchen feel hostile. I called the non-emergency line mid-morning and asked whether there was any way to find out what information the 911 operator had been working with when she told me not to move. The woman I spoke to was helpful but limited. She said she could note my inquiry and have someone follow up, that dispatch records were logged but not something she could access on my behalf directly. She suggested I come into the station if I wanted to make a formal request. I went that afternoon. Trish drove me. The officer at the desk, not either of the ones who'd come to the house, listened carefully and made a call to someone further back in the building. I sat in a plastic chair and watched a community notice board and waited. After about 15 minutes, a different officer came out, older, with the particular bearing of someone who had worked in the department long enough to have developed an economy of expression. He sat down across from me and confirmed that the call had been logged, that the response had been routine, and that the dispatcher, he didn't give me Diane's name, just said the dispatcher, had been acting on standard protocol throughout. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Standard protocol. It means she followed procedure based on the information available to her at the time." "What information?" A pause. Small but legible. "I'd need to pull the full record to give you specifics on that." "Can you do that?" "Not today. I can have someone contact you within 48 hours. 48 hours. I thanked him and stood up, and Trish drove me back to the house, and I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to figure out what information Diane could have had that standard protocol would use to justify telling a caller, in a whisper, that an intruder was still present. I couldn't find the mechanism. I'd looked it up on my phone while Trish drove, read 3 different pieces on 911 protocol, 2 forum threads from people who worked in dispatch, and nothing I found described a scenario where an operator with no additional information would communicate that specific detail in that specific way. She'd known something, or she'd been told something, and the gap between what she'd known and what the officers found when they searched the house, nothing, no one, the back door quietly relocked, was a gap I could not close no matter how many times I went around it. Trish stayed for dinner. We ordered pizza and watched something forgettable, and she offered to sleep over, and I said I was fine, which by that point had become a thing I said automatically and meant less each time. After she left, I locked the back door and stood in the kitchen and looked at the space where the chair had been. Then I went around the entire house, every room, every closet, under both beds, the small utility space behind the furnace that my dad used for storage, and checked each one carefully, the way I hadn't done the previous night because the officers had done it, and I'd trusted that. I found nothing. Everything was exactly as it should have been. But I lay in bed that night and thought about Diane's voice dropping into that whisper, and the thing I kept returning to, the thing I still return to, was how certain she'd sounded. Not worried, not hedging, not "I think," or "it's possible," or "we may have a situation." Just 4 words delivered with the flat, unhesitating certainty of someone stating a fact. "He's still in the house." She knew. Whatever she knew and however she knew it, she had been certain, and whoever had been in that house had left no trace that anyone could find. The 48-hour callback came in 36. A different officer this time, a woman named Vasquez, mid-40s, with the kind of measured phone voice that told me she'd been chosen specifically for this call rather than it falling to whoever was available. She introduced herself, confirmed she was following up on my inquiry about the dispatch record, and asked if I had a few minutes. I was sitting at the kitchen table. My parents had 4 more days in Portugal. I had not told them anything. "I've had a chance to review the call log from that evening," Vasquez said. "I want to be straightforward with you. The dispatcher did not have any additional information from a secondary caller or a patrol unit at the time she made that statement. She was working solely from your call." I let that sit for a moment. "So why did she say it?" "That's something we're looking into internally. It was an unusual deviation from standard protocol, and we're treating it as such." A pause. Professional. Measured. Not the pause of someone hiding something. More the pause of someone choosing precision. "What I can tell you is that the dispatcher has been with this department for 11 years and has an excellent record. We're not suggesting any wrongdoing, but the statement was outside procedure, and we take that seriously." "I'm not calling to get anyone in trouble," I said. "I just need to understand what she knew." "I understand that, and I want to be honest with you. Based on the log, we can't fully account for why she said what she said. Her notes from the call don't include anything that would explain it. She logged the call as routine." Routine. I thanked Vasquez and hung up and sat with the phone on the table in front of me and the morning light coming through the kitchen window at a low November angle. Logged as routine. Diane had dropped her voice to a whisper and told me with absolute certainty that there was someone in the house, and then logged the call as routine. Either she had a reason she hadn't recorded, or she had said it for a reason she couldn't explain, or something had come through on her end that had informed it, and then vanished without a trace in the same way that whoever had been in this house had vanished without a trace. I called Trish. She came over again. I told her what Vasquez had said, and watched her process it the same way I had, turning it over looking for an angle that resolved cleanly. She didn't find one. We sat together in the kitchen for a long time, not saying much, and the house was very quiet around us, and outside the November wind moved through the yard, and the bare branches of the maple tapped against the kitchen window in a slow, irregular rhythm. "You should call your parents," Trish said eventually. "There are 4 days left. I don't want to ruin the trip." "Carmen." "I know." I didn't call them. I told myself I'd tell them everything when they got home, that there was nothing actionable left to tell, that the police had been here and found nothing, and I was fine and the house was fine, and calling them now would only mean 4 days of my mother worrying from 4,000 miles away with nothing she could do about it. What I didn't tell Trish, what I hadn't told anyone, was that the night before, the third night since the incident, I'd woken at roughly the same time. 1:40 a.m., give or take. Not to a sound this time. Just awake, cleanly and completely, the way you come awake when something inside you decides the sleeping is finished. I'd lain still for a moment in the dark bedroom and done what I'd been doing every night since. Listened to the house, cataloged its sounds, confirmed the ones I recognized, and noted the absence of ones I didn't. And then I'd smelled it. Something faint and entirely out of place. Not cigarette smoke, not food, not the particular old house smell of the furnace running. Something else. Something I couldn't name immediately and then could. The specific, faintly chemical scent of a particular brand of soap. Not my soap, not my mother's. The kind of nondescript soap that came in bulk packaging, institutional almost. The kind you found in gas station bathrooms and budget motels. I'd lain completely still with that smell in the room, and I had not moved, and I had not turned on the lamp, and I had not called anyone, and after several minutes it had faded, and then it was gone, and I had stayed awake until 4 a.m. and then fallen asleep with the light on and not mentioned it to a single person the following day. I was not going to tell Trish about the soap, because telling Trish about the soap meant admitting that whatever this was, it hadn't ended with the police visit and the relocked back door and the logged routine call. It meant admitting that someone had been in the house a third time, or had still been there, residually present in a way the officer's search hadn't surfaced, and that I had lain in the dark and smelled their soap and done absolutely nothing about it. I should have done something about it. I know that. Looking back with everything I know now, staying still and waiting for it to pass was exactly the wrong response, and I have gone over that night many times, and each time I arrive at the same place. A person alone in a dark bedroom who was too frightened to make a sound, which is not stupidity. It is the body making its own calculations when the options available all feel equally dangerous. Trish left around 8. I relocked the back door and checked the front, and did my room by room, and went to bed with the hall light on and my phone charged on the nightstand. I woke at 1:38 a.m., 2 minutes earlier than the third night, 2 minutes earlier than the first night, not to a smell, not to a sound, to the feeling. Unmistakable, the same one from the bathroom floor, the same one from lying still with the soap smell in the room, of not being alone. I turned on the lamp before I could talk myself out of it. The bedroom was empty. The bedroom door, which I had closed before going to sleep, which I had watched myself close, had heard the latch engage, was standing open. 6 inches. A careful, deliberate 6 inches. The hallway beyond it was dark. I did not move for what felt like a very long time, sat upright in bed with the lamp on and my phone in my hand, and looked at those 6 inches of open door and the dark hallway beyond them, and ran through the math as quickly and honestly as I could. I had closed that door. I had heard the latch. There was no draft in this house strong enough to push a latched door open. I'd grown up here, I knew its drafts, and even if there had been, a latched door doesn't drift open to a careful, even 6 inches and stop. It swings, or it doesn't. It doesn't measure itself. Someone had opened it from the outside, had opened it and stopped, deliberately, at exactly the distance required to see through the gap into the room where I was sleeping. I was off the bed and in the bathroom with the door locked before I'd finished the thought, and this time I did not sit on the floor. I stood against the wall beside the door with my back flat against the plaster and my phone already unlocked on the emergency dial screen, and I listened to the hallway with everything I had. Silence. The specific, dense silence of a house at night. The furnace ticking, the maple branch against the kitchen window 3 floors down, the refrigerator's low hum carrying up through the walls. Nothing else. No footsteps, no creak of floorboards. Nothing that shouldn't be there. Which meant nothing. I knew that now. He moved without making sound. He opened doors and relocked them and rearranged chairs and came and went through this house like water through a closed fist, leaving almost no trace, and the absence of sound in a hallway was not the same as the absence of a person in it. I called 911, different dispatcher again, a man, efficient, who confirmed units were on the way and told me to stay where I was. I told him about the door. He logged it. He stayed on the line. The officers arrived in 8 minutes, and I heard them come in through the front, heard them move through the downstairs, heard them on the stairs, and I called out when they reached the upper hall, and one of them, a woman, older, with close-cropped gray hair, pushed open the bathroom door and found me standing against the wall with my back still flat against the plaster. Yeah. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that was professional and careful, and somewhere underneath both of those things quietly concerned. "You okay?" she said. "No," I said, which was the first completely honest thing I'd said to anyone in 4 days. They searched the house again. The same thorough room by room, the same flashlights in closets and underbeds and in the utility space behind the furnace. Her partner, younger, methodical, checked the back door and the front and both ground floor windows. Everything locked, everything undisturbed. The bedroom door was standing open exactly as I'd left it. The gray-haired officer, her name was Pellegrino, she told me when she came back, sat down with me on the edge of the bed and asked me to walk her through the last 4 nights from the beginning. Not the abbreviated version I'd given before. All of it. I told her everything, including the soap, which I hadn't told anyone. She wrote it down without any visible reaction, which I respected. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked a question that none of the other officers had asked. "Has anyone else had access to this house recently? Maintenance, repair work, anyone with a key other than your parents?" I thought about it. My parents were meticulous people, my mother especially, a woman who kept a spare key in a combination lockbox and changed the combination every year. But the house was 22 years old, and there had been contractors over the years, plumbers and electricians, and the company that had replaced the furnace 2 winters ago. Whether any of those people had copied a key was not something I could answer. Pellegrino's partner appeared in the doorway. He had something in his hand, small, held carefully by the edge between 2 fingers. He crossed the room and held it out to Pellegrino, and she looked at it for a moment before showing it to me. A key, not on a ring, not attached to anything. Just a single cut key, slightly worn, the kind that had been used enough that the bright metal of the teeth had dulled. Found under the lip of the baseboard heater on the far wall of the bedroom, the long, low unit that ran beneath the window. Pushed back just far enough that you wouldn't see it unless you were crouching with a flashlight specifically looking. I had never seen that key in my life. Pellegrino put it in an evidence bag and sealed it and wrote on the label, and I watched her do all of this with the specific suspended feeling of someone who has just had a large and terrible thing confirmed. Not the back door, not a lock that might have been left unlocked, not a chair that might have been at an angle I'd misremembered. A key, hidden in my bedroom. The bedroom I had been sleeping in for 4 nights, moving around in, getting dressed in, lying in the dark in, and the whole time, beneath the baseboard heater on the far wall, someone's key. "We're going to need to contact your parents," Pellegrino said. "I know," I said. "Tonight." "I know." She made the call herself, which I hadn't expected and was grateful for. Stood in the hallway and spoke in a low, even voice while I sat on the bed and looked at the baseboard heater and thought about every time I'd walked past it, every morning getting dressed, every evening before bed, the key sitting there in the dark underneath it, waiting, belonging to someone who knew exactly where they'd left it. My mother's voice came through the bedroom wall, not the words, just the pitch of it, rising. My father's lower register following, Pellegrino's steady, measured responses. I looked at the bedroom door, still open the same 6 inches I'd found it, carefully, deliberately, exactly 6 inches. I thought about Diane, about the absolute certainty in her voice, the 4 words with no hedging and no qualification. And I thought about the dispatch log Vasquez had described, routine, nothing to explain it. And I thought about 11 years of experience and an excellent record, and I wondered what it was that Diane had heard on her end of that line that she had decided not to write down. What sound, or what quality of silence, had told her with that kind of certainty that someone was still there? What she had heard that I hadn't. My parents flew home 2 days early. My father booked the flight while my mother was still on the phone with Pellegrino, which was exactly the kind of person my father was, not a man who talked about doing things while they still needed doing. They landed on a Thursday morning, and my mother walked through her front door and held me for a long time without saying anything. And my father went immediately and methodically through every room of the house the way fathers do when the alternative is feeling helpless, checking locks and windows and the baseboard heater and the utility space behind the furnace, as though his own inspection might find something the police had missed. It didn't, but I understood why he needed to do it. The key went to the department's forensics team. It came back clean, no usable prints, the surface wiped or handled with gloves or both. The cut pattern was standard, the kind any hardware store duplicated in 60 seconds for $3, which meant tracing it to a specific locksmith or a specific purchase was essentially impossible. Whatever door it opened, my parents' front door, the back, some secondary lock I wasn't aware of, was never determined with certainty, because when the locksmith my parents hired came to rekey the house, he found something that Pellegrino had not. A secondary lock on the interior basement door, the one that connected the main house to the unfinished utility space, that had been rekeyed sometime in the last several years with a cylinder that didn't match the original hardware. My parents had no memory of having it replaced. They had no key for it. The locksmith had to drill it. I've thought about that basement door more than almost anything else. More than the chair, more than the soap, more than even the key. Because the basement door was inside the house. You couldn't reach it from outside without already being inside. Which meant that at some point, before any of this started, someone had been in my parents' house long enough and comfortably enough to replace a lock cylinder on an interior door. Had sourced the hardware, had brought tools, had done the work. Had made themselves a private door inside someone else's home. The department's assessment was that the house had likely been accessed over a period of months, possibly longer. Possibly before my parents' trip, possibly for a very long time. My parents sold the house 8 months later. My mother told me she'd considered staying, that she'd had the locks changed and the basement door replaced and a security system installed, and had genuinely tried to inhabit the place normally for those 8 months, and for stretches she'd mostly managed it. But the house had changed for her in the same way it had changed for me, which was fundamentally and without remedy. It had become a place where someone had been without permission, had made private modifications, had moved through rooms she'd lived in for 22 years as though they were available to him whenever he wanted them. You don't unlearn that about a space. You carry it with you every time you unlock the door, every time you move through a room in the dark, every time you wake in the night and lie still listening to the house. They moved to a condo across town. 3rd floor, controlled building entry, no basement. I never spoke to Diane. I tried. I called the department twice and asked, as politely and reasonably as I could, whether I could speak with her, not to file a complaint, not to create any kind of record, just to understand what she had known and how she had known it. Both times I was told that dispatchers didn't take direct calls from the public and that any inquiry would need to go through official channels. I filed a formal request. It moved slowly through whatever process it moved through and eventually produced a written response from the department confirming only that the call had been reviewed and handled appropriately and that no further follow-up was necessary. No further follow-up was necessary. I kept the response in a folder I haven't opened in over a year. Kept it because throwing it away felt like closing something that wasn't closed, and I am still not ready to pretend that it is. The part I live with, the part that has never settled into anything resembling resolution, is the question of what Diane heard. Vasquez told me the log showed nothing. 11 years of experience and an excellent record and a deviation so significant that the department investigated it internally and then filed it away under appropriate. What did she hear in the silence on that line? What reached her on her end of the call? Some quality of the air, some faint displacement of sound, something that 11 years had taught her to recognize in the same way I had learned to recognize the furnace and the maple branch and the specific groan of the back door. That told her with the certainty of fact, no hedging, no qualification, that someone was in that house. She heard him. That is the only explanation I have been able to construct that accounts for all of it. Not a protocol, not a procedure, not a guess. She heard him somewhere in the background of my call, close enough to the phone to be picked up by the line, and she made a choice in that moment not to say it plainly, where he might also hear it. And so she whispered it, and then she logged it as nothing, because logging it as something would have meant explaining what she had heard and how close it had been to me. I don't know if that's right. I have no way of knowing if that's right, but it is the version that makes the most sense of everything. The absolute certainty, the whisper, the routine log. All of it points to a woman who heard something she couldn't write down, who made the only decision available to her in the second she had, who did it with an 11-year steadiness that probably saved my life. I am grateful to Diane. I have never been able to tell her that, and I think about it sometimes, the things you carry that you can't deliver. He was never identified, never caught. The case is technically open, listed somewhere in a department system as active, though what active means for a case with no suspect and no usable evidence and a family that has since moved away is something I have chosen not to investigate too closely. I stay on the 3rd floor now. I always tell people where I'm going. I lock every door behind me with both hands and I stand there for a moment after, feeling the bolt in its frame, making sure. I don't house sit anymore, and sometimes, in the specific quiet of a room at 1:38 in the morning, I think about a woman sitting at a dispatch console somewhere on the night side of a city, listening to a phone line, hearing something in the silence that the person on the other end couldn't hear, doing the only thing she could do with what she knew. I hope she's okay. I hope she doesn't carry it. I hope she found a way to log it as routine and leave it there. A woman at the grocery store grabbed my arm and said, "You need to stop letting him in." I had never seen her before. Her hand was around my wrist before I even registered she was standing there. Not a brush, not an accidental contact in a crowded aisle, a grip. Deliberate and firm, the kind that stops you mid-stride and takes a second to process because your brain first files it under mistake before it allows itself to consider the alternatives. I was reaching for something on the middle shelf, can't even tell you what now. And then there was a hand on my wrist and a woman standing closer than strangers stand, and her eyes were already on my face when I turned. She was maybe 60, small-framed, silver hair pulled back unevenly like she'd done it in a hurry, wearing a green rain jacket, the kind with the zip-out lining. Nothing remarkable about her, nothing that would have made me look twice if I'd passed her in the parking lot, except for her eyes, which were doing something I have never been able to adequately describe. Not wild, not the vacant intensity of someone in mental distress. Just very, very fixed. The eyes of someone who has decided to say a difficult thing and is not going to let the difficulty of it stop them. "You need to stop letting him in," she said. Her voice was low and even, almost conversational, like she was telling me I'd left my lights on. I stared at her. My wrist was still in her hand. "I'm sorry," I said, "because that's what you say when something so outside the frame of normal happens that your brain defaults to basic social script." She didn't repeat it, didn't elaborate, just held my gaze for another 2 or 3 seconds, long enough to make clear she was certain of what she'd said, and then released my wrist, stepped back, and walked away down the aisle without looking back. I stood there with a box of something in one hand and watched her turn the corner and disappear, and then I stood there a little longer, and then I put the box back on the wrong shelf and left my half-full cart where it was and walked out to my car. Sat there for a long time before I started the engine. Let me tell you about the 6 weeks before that, so you understand why I didn't immediately dismiss what she said. I'd moved to Belwick in September, mid-sized city, Pacific Northwest, the kind of place where it starts raining in October and doesn't fully stop until May, and somehow everyone who lives there acts like this is fine. I'd taken a position with an urban planning consultancy, a real step up from where I'd been, and the job justified the move in all the ways that matter on paper. I was 27, I was ready, I told myself both of those things often enough that I mostly believed them. I'd met Daniel in October, 6 weeks in, right at the point where I was starting to feel the specific weight of not knowing anyone. The way a city can be full of people and still feel like an empty room when none of them know your name. He'd been at a bar where a co-worker had dragged me for a birthday thing, sitting at the far end with a mutual acquaintance between us, and we'd ended up in a conversation that lasted until the bar closed. Easy, warm, the kind of conversation that makes a strange city feel briefly less enormous. He was 32, quiet in a way that felt considered rather than cold. Dark hair, good hands, a habit of pausing before he answered questions that I initially found attractive, that sense of someone who doesn't speak until they mean it. He worked in something adjacent to architecture, contracts and permits, and city compliance, which meant our professional worlds overlapped just enough to give us things to talk about. We started spending time together, not officially, not with any conversation about what it was, just gravitating toward each other the way you do when you're new somewhere and someone makes you feel less new. He came to my apartment for the first time about 2 weeks in, stayed late, came back the following weekend. The first time I woke up and found him sitting in the dark, I told myself it was nothing. He'd been there for dinner, my place, I'd cooked, it had been a good night. We'd fallen asleep late, and I woke at some point in the small hours, that sudden, clean wakefulness that has no apparent cause, and rolled over to find the other side of the bed empty. The bedroom door was slightly open, and the light from the living room was off, which meant either he'd left without telling me or he was in the apartment somewhere in the dark. I padded out to the living room, and he was sitting on the couch, not on his phone, not doing anything, just sitting in the dark with his hands on his knees and his face turned toward the window. The street outside was wet from the rain that had come through earlier, the pavement orange lit and empty. I asked him if he was okay. He turned and looked at me and said yes, he just couldn't sleep, and smiled in a way that settled it, and came back to bed. And I believed him because it was a normal enough thing. Insomnia was a normal enough thing, and I was 27 and new to the city, and I was not going to find reasons to be suspicious of the one person who made me feel less alone in it. That was the first time. After the woman at the grocery store, I sat in my car and stared at the rain on the windscreen and counted how many times there had been since. I got to 7 before I stopped counting. Not because I ran out of instances, because 7 was already enough to make my hands shake. The 7 things were not dramatic. That's what made them difficult to hold on to as evidence of anything. Each one, taken individually, dissolved under the mildest scrutiny. It was only when I lined them up in the car outside the grocery store, rain coming down steady and gray on the roof, that the shape they made together stopped looking like coincidence. The second time I found him sitting in the dark, it was in the kitchen. 2-something in the morning. I'd gotten up for water, and there he was at the kitchen table, same stillness as the first time, hands flat on the surface, face turned toward the window above the sink. The window looks out onto the building's interior courtyard, a small square of concrete with a drain in the middle and a single light mounted above the back door that stays on all night. Nothing out there. He turned when he heard me, did the same smile, said the same thing about not sleeping. I got my water and went back to bed, and in the morning I mentioned I was a light sleeper and maybe we should talk about what to do when he couldn't sleep, and he said, of course, he was sorry he'd worried me, and that was the end of it. The third time I didn't find him anywhere. I'd woken at 3 a.m., and his side of the bed was empty, and I'd checked the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, all empty, all dark. The front door was locked from the inside, chain still on, which meant he hadn't left. I checked every room twice. Then I went back to the bedroom and he was there, in bed, apparently asleep, in a position I was almost certain he hadn't been in 30 seconds ago. I stood in the doorway and watched him breathe and told myself I'd somehow missed him, that I'd looked without seeing, that this was what happened when you woke disoriented in a dark apartment at 3 in the morning. I went back to sleep. I didn't tell him about that one. The 4th and 5th things were smaller and harder to name, the kind that don't have clean edges. Twice, I walked into a room he'd been alone in and felt something shift, the way a room feels when the air has been recently disturbed, when someone has moved through it just before you arrived. Both times he was perfectly still when I entered. Both times he looked up at me with an expression that was entirely normal and entirely present. I couldn't point to anything specific, couldn't say, this is wrong. Just that low-frequency wrongness that the body clocks before the brain does, the thing your instincts file away while your conscious mind overrules them. The 6th thing was a question. We were in bed reading, or I was reading. He was lying on his back, looking at the ceiling in that particular wakeful stillness he had, and he asked, without any preamble, without it following from anything, "Do you ever feel like your apartment is bigger at night?" I asked what he meant. He was quiet for a moment, like the rooms extend further than they do in the day, like there's more space in the dark than the walls account for. I put my book down, looked at him. He was still looking at the ceiling, his expression neutral and considering, like he was working through a mildly interesting architectural observation. I said I'd never noticed that. He nodded slowly and didn't say anything else, and after a while, I picked my book back up, and we went to sleep. But I lay awake longer than usual that night, listening to the apartment settle around me, and I thought about what he'd said, and felt the particular unease of a sentence that seems ordinary and isn't, that lodges somewhere beneath your ribs and stays there. The 7th thing happened 4 days before the grocery store. I came home from work to find my front door unlocked. Not broken, not forced, just unlocked. I had locked it that morning. I was certain of it. I was the kind of person who checked the handle twice and pulled it once before walking away. Daniel had a key. I'd given him one 3 weeks in, which in retrospect was fast, but at the time had felt like a natural thing between 2 adults navigating the early territory of something that might become more. He had his own apartment across the city. He wasn't in the habit of letting himself in unannounced. But when I pushed the door open, he was there. Sitting in the armchair by the window, not the couch, the armchair, which was positioned slightly away from the room's natural sight line from the door, which meant I didn't immediately see him. I'd walked 3 steps inside before I registered the shape of him and made a sound I'm not proud of. A sharp, involuntary gasp that he responded to with immediate concern, standing up, hands out. I'm sorry. I should have texted. I wanted to surprise you. It was a reasonable explanation. A normal person explanation. People with keys let themselves into their partner's apartment. People tried to do sweet things and misjudged the execution. I told him it was fine, made dinner, stayed mostly fine all evening. But after he left, I walked around the apartment slowly, room by room, without knowing quite what I was looking for. Everything was where it should be. Nothing was missing or moved or disturbed. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it that morning, except for the chair, which had been angled slightly away from the wall in a way I didn't remember it being. I pushed it back, stood back, looked at where it had been. Positioned like that, it faced the bedroom door directly. I went to the grocery store the next morning to get out of the apartment for a few hours to put some ordinary errand-shaped structure around the unease I couldn't name or resolve. I was in the third aisle when a woman I had never seen before put her hand around my wrist and told me I needed to stop letting him in. And now I was sitting in my car in the rain, adding it up. 7 things. One stranger who somehow knew there was a him to warn me about. My phone was in my lap. I opened my contacts and scrolled to Daniel's name, and my thumb hovered there for a long moment, the screen dimming while I didn't press it. Then I scrolled past it to my friend Cass, who lived 2 hours south and answered on the 3rd ring, and I said, before she could say anything beyond hello, I said, "Something is wrong, and I don't know how to explain it, but I need to say it out loud to someone who isn't him." She said, "Start from the beginning." So I did. Cass listened to all of it without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always loved about her, and which I particularly needed in that moment. Just the quality of being genuinely heard, of someone on the other end of the line actually taking in what you're saying, rather than assembling their response while you're still talking. I went through everything in order. The first time in the dark, the kitchen, the disappeared and reappeared incident, the rooms that felt disturbed, the ceiling question, the chair facing my bedroom door. And then the woman in the grocery store, the grip of her hand, those 8 words delivered in a voice as calm as a weather report. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Tell me about the ceiling thing again," Cass said. I told her again. She was quiet through it. "And he said that, like it was a normal observation," she said. "Not a question. He said it the way you'd say something like, 'Have you noticed the traffic is worse on Thursdays?'" "Right." Another pause. "And the chair. You're certain it had moved?" "I'm certain. I know how I leave a room, Cass. I've lived alone for 4 years. I have habits. I know where things are." "I know you do." Her voice had shifted into something careful. "Okay. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to really think about it before you answer. Is there any version of this where Daniel is just an odd person? Like genuinely bad at sleeping, genuinely spacey, genuinely thought the key thing would be a nice surprise and misjudged it? Because individually, each of these..." "I know," I said. "Individually, they're nothing. But together they feel like something I can't name." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who is he, actually? What do you know about him?" And that was when I realized, sitting in that car with the rain thickening on the windscreen and the grocery store's fluorescent glow visible through the glass doors across the lot, that was when I realized I knew almost nothing. I knew what he'd told me. I knew his first name, his approximate profession, the name of his neighborhood, 3 or 4 stories from his past that I had no way of verifying. I had never been to his apartment. I had met none of his friends. In 6 weeks of spending real time together, I had acquired the information a person chooses to offer, and nothing that existed independently of his willingness to provide it. Cass said, gently, "Find out who he is before you see him again." I drove home, sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started with what I had: full name, approximate employer, neighborhood, physical description. Spent 2 hours going carefully through the kinds of digital traces people leave without thinking. LinkedIn, public records, local news archives, the small, persistent fragments that accumulate when someone has lived somewhere for a while. I was not a paranoid person, and I was not someone who routinely researched the people in my life, and the whole thing felt clinical and strange and slightly shameful, the way it feels to do something necessary that you wish weren't necessary. What I found was not nothing, but it was close. A LinkedIn profile that was sparse in a way that felt maintained rather than neglected, enough there to be credible, not enough to be verifiable. A name in the public comments of a local zoning board meeting from 3 years ago, consistent with the work he'd described. No social media presence I could find. No photos of him attached to anything outside the LinkedIn headshot, which was small and slightly blurred, and could have been anyone with dark hair in a collared shirt. What I did not find, after 2 hours of careful searching, anyone who knew him. No friends who tagged him in things. No professional contacts who'd posted about working with him. No alumni associations. No community organizations. No neighborhood groups. For someone who claimed to have lived in Belwick for nearly 8 years, he had left almost no impression on the public record of the place. Like a person who had been careful, consistently, and over a long period of time, to keep the surface of their life very smooth and very undetectable. I sat back and looked at the screen and felt the unease crystallize into something colder and more specific. Then I called the building manager of my apartment complex. I want to be clear that I understand this sounds strange, but I'd been thinking about the unlocked door for 3 days, and I had a specific question. I asked whether anyone had requested a key copy for my unit recently, or whether any maintenance had been done that would have required access when I wasn't home. She checked. Said there had been no maintenance requests on my unit in 2 months. Said key copies for tenant units were not issued to anyone without written request from the tenant. She paused. Then she said, and I felt the bottom of something drop out when she said it, that the building's master key had been reported missing 6 weeks ago. Right around the time Daniel had first come to my apartment, they had assumed it was mislaid. It happened occasionally. A replacement had been cut, a report filed. Nobody had thought much of it. I thanked her and ended the call, and sat very still at my kitchen table. Outside, the rain was coming down in long gray sheets, running off the windowsill in a thin curtain of water, filling the courtyard below with the sound of steady accumulation. The light above the back door cut a pale circle in the wet concrete. The courtyard was empty. I had given Daniel my key 3 weeks ago, which I thought had been fast. But that wasn't when he'd first had access to my apartment. He'd had access since the beginning. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Daniel. Thinking of you. Coming by tonight if that's all right. I put the phone face down, picked up my laptop instead and opened a new tab and found the grocery store's website and dug through it until I found a contact email for their management office. Sent a message asking whether there was any way to access footage from their in-store cameras from that morning and whether they might be willing to help me identify a woman I'd spoken to briefly in the third aisle. Long shot. I knew it was a long shot. But the woman had known his name, had said him specifically with the certainty of someone referring to something known, which meant she wasn't a stranger who had randomly attached herself to me in a grocery store. She had come there for a reason, and if she had come there for a reason, she might come back. I needed to find her before Daniel found his way back into my apartment, and I lost the nerve I was barely managing to hold on to. I stared at the sent message on my screen. Then I got up, walked to my front door, and turned the deadbolt, slid the chain across. And for the first time in 6 weeks, I felt the specific relief of a door that was genuinely closed. Daniel texted twice more that evening. First message at 7. Let me know if tonight doesn't work, no pressure. Second at 9:15. Everything okay? I didn't reply to either. Sat on my couch with every light in the apartment on, not because I was afraid of the dark exactly, but because the dark had started to feel like something that belonged to him, and I wanted every corner visible and accounted for. Ate crackers and cheese, standing over the kitchen sink because sitting down to a real meal felt like too much stillness. Checked the deadbolt 3 times. At 10:40 my phone rang. His name on the screen. I watched it ring, let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. The grocery store's management office responded to my email at 8 the next morning, faster than I'd expected, which meant either the footage request was simpler than I'd thought, or someone had read the email and felt it warranted prompt attention. The message said they'd be happy to assist if I could come in and speak with the duty manager, and that they did retain footage for 30 days as a matter of policy. I was there by 9. The duty manager was a tired-looking man named Phil, who took the situation seriously in the way people do when they sense there might be more behind a request than is being stated. He pulled the aisle 3 footage from the previous morning without requiring much explanation. We stood at a monitor in a small office behind the service desk, and he scrubbed through it until we found the timestamp that matched. And there I was, reaching for the shelf, and there she was, stepping into frame from the right. She had come from the direction of the entrance, had walked directly to aisle 3, had stopped near me with the purposeful efficiency of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Phil leaned in. "Do you recognize her?" I shook my head. "She's been in before." He said it slowly, like he was working something out while he spoke. "I'm trying to... yeah." He scrubbed back, pulled up a different angle, the wider entrance camera. "Here, 4 days ago. Same green rain jacket, same uneven silver hair, coming through the entrance, walking with that same direct purposefulness all the way to," Phil zoomed to the angle, "the customer service desk. She stood there for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, speaking to the young woman behind the counter, then left without buying anything." "Can you find out what she asked about?" I said. He went and spoke to the woman from the desk who had worked the shift 4 days ago. Came back looking noticeably less comfortable than he had 2 minutes prior. "She came in asking about a regular customer," he said carefully. She described someone, a woman in her late 20s, worked from home, brown hair. She said she had an urgent message for her but didn't know her name, asked if any staff recognized the description and knew anything about her. He paused. The staff member said she hadn't been able to help her. I stood very still. She hadn't wandered into that grocery store and happened upon me. She had been looking for me specifically, for at least 4 days, visiting places I might be. She had managed to find me, eventually, and what she'd had to say had been 8 words and nothing else, because whatever she knew, she hadn't been willing to say it in the middle of a grocery aisle where Daniel could what? Where Daniel might find out she'd said it. I drove home too fast and didn't remember most of the drive. Pulled into the parking garage beneath my building and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, thinking about the master key missing since the day Daniel had first come to my apartment. About 7 instances of waking to find him somewhere he shouldn't have been, or a room that felt disturbed, or a door unlocked. About a woman who had been searching for me across multiple days with a warning she couldn't safely deliver indoors. I was reaching for my door handle when I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the parking garage, near the stairwell door. Just standing there, in the particular stillness I'd come to recognize, hands at his sides, face turned toward my car. The garage's fluorescent lighting was patchy. One panel in the middle section was out, and he was just at the edge of where the light reached, which made it difficult to read his expression. But he was looking directly at me. Had been, I realized, since before I'd noticed him. He hadn't moved when I pulled in, hadn't shifted or waved or done anything a person does when they're spotted somewhere slightly unexpected. He just stood there, watching. I locked the car doors, sat for a moment, heart loud in my ears, running through my options. I couldn't go up to the apartment. He was between me and the stairwell. Couldn't stay in the car. Couldn't... He took a step forward. I started the engine. He stopped. We stayed like that. 10 seconds. 15. My hand on the gear shift and his body very still at the edge of the light. and then I reversed out of the space and drove back up the ramp and out of the garage without looking in the rearview mirror until I was on the street and half a block away, hands shaking on the wheel, eyes stinging in a way I refused to let become crying because I needed to be able to see. I called Cass and she picked up immediately, and I told her where I was and what I'd seen, and she said, "Drive to me, right now. Don't go back there tonight." And I said, I didn't have anything, no clothes, no charger. My laptop was in the apartment. And she said, "None of that matters. Drive to me." So I drove to her. 2 hours south on a wet November highway, rain on the windscreen the whole way, the wipers keeping steady time, the city shrinking in my mirrors until it was just light against low cloud, and then nothing at all. My phone lit up twice on the passenger seat with his name, and I let it go dark both times and kept driving. 2 hours of trying not to think about how long he'd been standing in the parking garage. 2 hours of wondering whether he'd been down there waiting, or whether he'd followed me back from the grocery store. 2 hours of understanding, with a cold clarity that had replaced every other feeling, that the woman in the green rain jacket had not been a stranger with a strange gift for knowing things. She had been a warning, and the warning had come in the form of 8 words, because 8 words was all she'd had time for before she needed to be somewhere else, somewhere he wouldn't see her talking to me, which meant she knew him, and she was afraid of him too. Cass opened her door before I'd finished knocking. She took one look at me, still in my coat, keys in my hand, the particular hollowed-out expression of someone who has been holding themselves together across 114 miles of dark highway, and pulled me inside without saying anything. Made tea. Sat across from me at her kitchen table while I talked through all of it again. The version with the parking garage appended to the end, and by the time I finished, the tea had gone cold, and she had the expression of someone who had fully set aside the part of them that wanted to find an alternative explanation. "We need to find her," she said. "The woman." I told her I'd already emailed the grocery store, that they had footage, that she'd been there before. Cass nodded slowly, working something through. Then she said, "If she was looking for you specifically, she had some way of knowing you existed, which means she has some connection to him, which means there's a trail." She was right, and I knew she was right. But the idea of pulling on that thread, of finding out what the woman in the green jacket knew and how she knew it, sat heavily in a way I couldn't immediately explain. Some part of me understood that knowing would cost something, that there was a version of the next few days in which I found out what Daniel was, what he had done, and that knowledge would not leave me the same shape it found me. I slept on Cass's couch. Didn't sleep well. The grocery store responded to a follow-up email the next morning saying they'd hold the footage and would cooperate with any formal request, but that they weren't able to share personal information about customers without appropriate authorization, which was a reasonable position that helped me not at all. I filed a report with Belwick Police that afternoon, the missing master key, the unlocked door, the garage, and sat across from an officer who took careful notes and said all the right things, and told me to document everything and contact them if there was any direct threatening contact. The particular brand of helpfulness that means the system needs something worse to happen before it can act. Daniel texted one more time the morning after I left. Not my name, not a question, just, "I know you spoke to someone about me." That was all. No follow-up, no explanation, no pretense of normalcy. Just that sentence, delivered at 7:43 in the morning, landing on my phone screen with the flat certainty of something that didn't need to make a threat because the implication was enough. I forwarded it to the officer who'd taken my report and didn't reply to Daniel. He didn't contact me again after that. Not that week, not the week after. His number stayed in my phone because deleting it felt like losing track of something I needed to be able to identify. And every time I saw it there in my contacts without a notification beside it, I felt something that was partly relief and partly the specific unease of a thing that has gone quiet without explanation. The woman in the green jacket found me. Or rather, and this took several more weeks and Cass doing the kind of diligent, patient searching that I was too frightened to do myself. We found her. Her name was Rowan. She was 58, and she had lived in Belwick for 11 years, and she had met Daniel 4 years before I did. She agreed to a phone call with the careful wariness of someone who has learned to be selective about who she trusts with certain information. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it from the grocery store. Level, measured, the voice of someone who has had a long time to arrive at calm. She talked for nearly an hour. I won't repeat all of it here, partly because some of it is hers to keep, and partly because some of it is still making its way through the formal channels that process these things slowly and imperfectly. What I will say is this: I was not the first. There had been others between her and me, and she had tried to reach at least one of them and not managed it in time, and she had found me through a combination of the particular diligence of someone with long experience and the small digital traces I'd left as a new arrival in the city, a professional profile, a tagged photo from a work event, enough to locate me by neighborhood and routine. She had gone to the grocery store 4 times before she found me. She said, near the end of the call, that she was sorry she'd only been able to give me 8 words, that she'd seen him park 2 rows over from me in the lot and had understood she had perhaps 90 seconds before he came through the entrance, and she'd had to make a choice about what to put into 90 seconds. She'd chosen the most essential thing. I told her it was enough. It was enough because I'd heard it when it landed, somewhere below the part of me that wanted to rationalize, in the part that had been keeping count of 7 instances and going quiet in rooms and watching an armchair face my bedroom door and knowing, without allowing itself to fully know, that something was deeply and specifically wrong. I still live in Belwick. Different apartment, different building, 3rd floor with a coded entrance and a deadbolt. I change every time I move in, and a door I do not open without knowing who is on the other side. The position at the consultancy is good. I have made friends here, slowly. The way you make friends in a new city, when you stop attaching yourself to whoever makes the loneliness easiest to bear in the first weeks. I think about Rowan's 4 visits to the grocery store, the calculation she made in a parking lot with 90 seconds on the clock. I think about what I almost didn't hear. You know the feeling I mean. That low, insistent frequency beneath the noise of wanting things to be fine, of not wanting to be the person who makes it complicated, of needing someone so much you'll overlook the shape of what you're accepting. You've felt it. Most of us have. Don't overlook the shape of it. When a stranger takes your wrist in a grocery aisle and says something to you in a voice that has already decided you're worth the risk, listen, completely and without qualification. Listen. My daughter asked who the man in her room was. We searched the house and found a warm sleeping bag behind the water heater. The thing about being a parent is that you spend so much energy trying to protect your kids from things that aren't real, that when something real comes along, you almost miss it. My daughter Nora was 5 when this happened. We'd moved into the house on Clement Drive in late July. My wife, Adele, and I, Nora, and the cat, who hated the new house for the first 3 weeks, and then pretended she'd always lived there. It was our first real house, the kind with a yard, and a basement, and a driveway, and a water heater that was apparently our responsibility now. 11 years of apartments had not prepared me for the psychological weight of owning a water heater. We'd been saving for 6 years to afford the down payment. We were proud of it in the unguarded, slightly embarrassing way that people are proud of the first thing they've worked that hard for. The neighborhood was quiet. One of those mid-century suburban streets where everyone had lived there long enough to stop introducing themselves to newcomers, but still waved from driveways. The school was 3 blocks away. The backyard had an oak tree big enough that I'd already started pricing rope ladders, partly for Nora and mostly for myself. We'd done everything right. Checked the neighborhood, hired the inspector, had the locks rekeyed before we moved in. The locksmith was a guy named Ted, 50s, very thorough. Told me the previous owners had installed good hardware and the rekeying would take 40 minutes. I stood there and watched him do it and felt like a responsible adult. Nora took to the house immediately. She claimed the smaller of the two upstairs bedrooms, turned down the bigger one, which still baffles me, and within a week had organized it in a way that made complete sense only to her. Stuffed animals arranged by some internal logic, drawings taped to the wall at heights that required her to have stood on her desk chair. Her window looked out over the side yard and the wooden fence and the Patterson's rose bushes next door. She said it smelled like a real room, which I think was meant as a compliment. The first time she mentioned him, I wrote it straight into the ledger of childhood imagination and didn't think about it again for 2 weeks. It was a Thursday evening in September. Adele was downstairs. I was putting Nora to bed. The routine of it, the same books in the same order. The lamp on the nightstand left on low because she didn't like the dark. She was lying on her back looking at the ceiling in that drowsy, between-worlds way she got right before sleep, and she said, without particular urgency, "Who is the man who comes in my room?" I stopped. "What man? Bug?" "The man." She blinked slowly. "He stands by the window." I looked at the window. Dark outside, the curtains not quite fully closed, a narrow slice of the side yard visible, the fence, the edge of the rose bushes, the amber wash of the neighbor's motion light. Nothing there. "There's no man, Bug," I said, the way you say it when you are certain and patient and not at all unsettled. "You were probably dreaming." "I wasn't asleep yet," she said, and then she was. I pulled the curtain fully closed and went downstairs and told Adele, and we talked about it the way parents talk about the inexplicable things small children say, half amused, half that particular low-grade parental alertness that never fully turns off. We landed on imaginary friend, sleep hypnagogia, the strangeness of a new room, all of which were rational, all of which I believed completely for the next 2 weeks. The second time she mentioned him was different. It was a Saturday morning, October 4th, just after breakfast. Nora came downstairs with a piece of paper she'd been drawing on, her standard output, those dense crayon scenes with no regard for scale, and put it on the table in front of me. A house, our house, recognizably, the oak tree, a brown vertical with a green cloud on top. In Nora's bedroom window, drawn in black crayon, a figure, tall, narrow, just standing there. "Is that the man?" I asked. "Yes," she said, and went to find the cat. Adele and I looked at each other across the table. Outside the kitchen window, the October morning was gray and cold, the first real cold of the season, and the trees in the backyard had gone yellow overnight the way they do when you're not watching. We decided to search the house. We did it together while Nora watched cartoons, methodical and half-embarrassed about our own thoroughness. Closets, the basement, the garage, under the beds, the attic access panel which required a step stool and produced nothing but insulation and a dead wasp. Every door, every window, every space large enough for a person. It took 45 minutes. We found nothing. The house was clean and ordinary and fully ours in every direction we looked. Adele made more coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table with Nora's drawing in front of me and felt the specific, slightly hollow relief of having been right about something that you hadn't wanted to be wrong about. The cat came and sat on the drawing, and I took that as a sign to stop thinking about it. We didn't check behind the water heater. Nobody thinks to check behind the water heater. October moved through the way October does, fast and cold, the yard filling up with leaves I kept meaning to rake, the evenings closing in earlier every day. Nora started soccer. Adele picked up a new project at work that had her at the kitchen table with her laptop most nights after dinner. The house settled into being ours in the small, unremarkable ways that matter. The cabinet that sticks, the third stair that creaks, the way the radiator in the upstairs hallway clanks twice before the heat comes on like it's clearing its throat. You learn the sounds of a house, you stop hearing them. Nora didn't mention the man again. 3 weeks went by, and then 4, and I thought about the drawing less and less, filed it in the same mental folder as the phase where she'd insisted something lived in the bathtub drain, and the month she'd refused to eat anything orange. Children were strange, and then they moved on, and you moved on with them. That was the deal. But I started noticing other things, small things, the kind of things that don't announce themselves, that you only recognize as a pattern once you've collected enough of them to lay side by side. The first was the food. We kept a bowl of fruit on the kitchen counter, apples, bananas, whatever was in season, and I started noticing it depleting faster than it should. Not dramatically, not in a way you could point to and say something is wrong here, just faster. I mentioned it to Adele once, and she said she'd been eating more fruit with lunch, which was plausible, and that was the end of it. But I started paying attention without meaning to, the way you do when something has lodged in you below the level of conscious thought. The second was the basement door. We kept it closed. The basement was unfinished, used mostly for storage and the utility area, not somewhere we went often. I found it open twice in the space of 10 days. The first time I assumed I'd left it, which I might have. The second time I was more certain I hadn't, but certainty about a door you walk past a dozen times a day is slippery, and I didn't trust myself enough to say it out loud. The third thing was the smell. It started sometime in mid-October, faint, intermittent, the kind of smell that's there when you first come into a room and gone by the time you've been in it for 5 minutes. Something unwashed, slightly close, the smell of a space where air doesn't move. It was strongest near the basement door, and I told myself it was the basement itself. Old concrete and stored boxes, and the particular mustiness of a space that doesn't get enough ventilation. I opened the basement windows. The smell faded. I stopped thinking about it. What finally broke through the surface wasn't any of those things. It was the cat. Her name was Biscuit. Nora had named her, obviously, and she was a 7-year-old tabby of extremely fixed opinions about where she would and wouldn't go. In 11 years of living with us, she had established clear territories in every apartment, specific chairs and radiator spots and window ledges that were hers, and she defended them with the passive authority of someone who has never doubted their own right to take up space. From the day we moved into the house on Clement Drive, Biscuit refused to go in the basement. This was new. Previous apartments had always included whatever utility spaces were available. She'd been happy in closets, laundry rooms, the narrow service corridor of our second apartment that smelled like mildew and that we'd always assumed was a health hazard. But the basement door, if left open, she would approach, sniff once at the threshold with the particular focused attention she gave to things she'd decided were adversarial, and then sit back and refuse to cross it every time. I'd registered this as quirk and moved on. Cats had quirks. Biscuit had many. But one evening in late October, I was sitting at the kitchen table after Nora was in bed, Adele asleep upstairs, the house quiet, the rain tapping steadily at the window. And Biscuit came and sat in the hallway outside the basement door and began to make a sound I hadn't heard from her before. Not her usual protest sounds, not the demanding yowl she used for food and attention. Something lower, more sustained, the sound of an animal directing focused attention at a specific point in space and not looking away. She sat there for 40 minutes. I checked because after the first 10 I started watching her the way you watch something you can't fully ignore. She didn't move, didn't break her line of sight from the basement door, just sat there in the hallway with the rain coming down outside, making that low sound into the silence, communicating something to whatever was on the other side that she had absolutely no interest in communicating to me. I went to bed eventually. I told myself the cat was strange. The cat had always been strange. This was a new house with new smells and new sounds, and she was adjusting in her own particular way. The next morning, I came downstairs and the fruit bowl had a banana missing. I stood at the kitchen counter and looked at it and counted what had been there the night before. 2 apples, 3 bananas, a pear, and counted what was there now. 2 apples, 2 bananas, the pear. I stood there for a long moment in the early morning silence while the coffee brewed and the house made its waking up sounds. And I thought about the basement door and the smell and Biscuit and her 40 minutes in the hallway. Then I went upstairs and woke Adele and told her I needed her to come downstairs. She came down in her robe, still half asleep, and I pointed at the fruit bowl and told her about the banana, and she looked at me with the patient expression she uses when she's waiting to understand why something is a problem. I told her about the other times, the fruit moving faster than it should, the door, the smell, the cat. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very calmly, "We need to go through the whole house again, right now, properly." "Nora's still asleep," I said. "I know." She was already moving toward the basement door. "That's why we're doing it now." The basement stairs were bare wood, the kind that flex slightly underfoot and announce every step. I went first. Adele stayed close behind me, one hand on my shoulder, and we descended into the particular cold of an unfinished basement in late October, damp concrete and old insulation and the low mechanical hum of the water heater doing its job in the far corner. I hit the light switch at the bottom of the stairs. A single overhead bulb came on, one of those pull-chain fixtures we'd meant to replace, throwing a hard yellow circle in the middle of the space and leaving the perimeter in shadow. The basement ran the full footprint of the house, maybe 800 square feet of unfinished floor, a support beam down the center, our storage boxes stacked along the near wall, the utility area in the far corner where the water heater and the furnace and the electrical panel lived behind a half wall of cinder block that the previous owners had built for reasons that hadn't been explained in the listing. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at all of it and felt, for just a moment, completely foolish. It was a basement. Our basement. Full of our boxes and our old furniture and the 2 bicycles we kept meaning to sell and the water heater doing its steady, indifferent work. "Start with the storage area," Adele said quietly behind me. We went through it methodically, moving boxes, checking behind the old couch we'd pushed against the wall, opening the wardrobe we used for off-season coats. Everything was as we'd left it. Our things, arranged the way we'd arranged them when we moved in, collecting the fine gray dust of a space that didn't get disturbed often. We moved toward the utility corner. The half wall of cinder block was maybe 4 feet high, enclosing the water heater and furnace on 3 sides with a gap at the front for access. I'd been back here twice, once with the home inspector, once when I'd needed to check the water heater's pilot light in August. It wasn't a space you spent time in. Low clearance, cramped, the heat radiating off the water heater making it uncomfortable even in summer. I leaned over the half wall and looked in. The water heater on the right, the furnace on the left, the electrical conduit running up the back wall, and behind the water heater, in the narrow channel of space between the tank and the cinder block, something that shouldn't have been there. A sleeping bag, dark green, the compact military-style kind, rolled out flat in the space like someone had arranged it carefully. A backpack against the back wall, small and dark, partially unzipped. A water bottle, plastic, wedged between the backpack and the cinder block. And beside the water bottle, a small collection of things arranged with a neatness that was somehow the most disturbing detail of all. A folded piece of cloth that might have been a spare shirt, a paperback book with a cracked spine, a phone charging cable coiled and set on top. I didn't move for a long moment. "Adele," I said. She was beside me before I finished her name. I heard her sharp intake of breath when she saw it. Not a scream, not even a gasp. Just that single, involuntary compression of air that a person makes when their body processes something before their mind catches up. I reached down and put my hand on the sleeping bag. It was warm, not the ambient warmth of the room, not the residual warmth of the water heater nearby. Genuinely warm, the specific retained warmth of a sleeping bag that has had a person inside it recently. Within the hour, I would think later, maybe less. I pulled my hand back. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The water heater hummed. Upstairs, distantly, I heard the creak of Nora's bed, her turning over, still asleep, the ordinary sound of our daughter in her room directly above us. "We need to go upstairs," Adele said. Her voice was completely steady in a way that told me she was operating on some emergency frequency that had bypassed the part of her brain that was currently screaming. "Right now, get Nora and go outside. He might still be, I know." She was already moving toward the stairs. "Come on." We went up fast, not quiet anymore, not caring. I was 2 steps behind Adele, and my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She went straight to Nora's room, and I went to the front door and unlocked it and stood in the doorway looking at the empty morning street and the Pattersons' rose bushes and the unremarkable suburban quiet of Clement Drive while my heart tried to exit through my ribs. Adele came down with Nora on her hip, still in pajamas, still half asleep, head on Adele's shoulder and eyes mostly closed. The cat was threading around Adele's ankles on the stairs with sudden, urgent sociability, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this. We went outside and I called 911 from the driveway. The dispatcher asked if we believed the intruder was still in the house. I said I didn't know. She told me to stay outside, stay away from the structure, and that officers were on their way. I stood in the driveway in my socks on the cold concrete, with my arm around Adele and Nora between us, and I looked at the front of the house. Our house, the one we'd saved for 6 years to afford, the one with the oak tree and the 3rd stair that creaks, and I tried to understand how long someone had been living inside it. "Daddy," Nora said, suddenly more awake, looking up at me with the calm curiosity of a child who hasn't yet been told there is something to be afraid of. "Is the man going away?" I looked at her. "Yes, Bug," I said. "He's going away." The police arrived in 4 minutes. It felt like 40. 3 officers came in the first car, a 4th in a second car, 2 minutes behind. They moved us further down the driveway, away from the structure, one of them said, in the tone of someone who uses that word because it helps to think of your house as a structure sometimes. Adele took Nora next door to the Pattersons, who opened their door in bathrobes without asking questions the way good neighbors do. I stayed at the end of the driveway and watched the officers go inside. The waiting was its own particular kind of unbearable. I stood in my socks on the cold concrete of Clement Drive at 7:40 in the morning and stared at the open front door and listened to the muffled sounds of people moving through my house. Footsteps on the stairs, voices low and procedural, the basement door opening and closing. A female officer stayed with me in the driveway and asked me questions in a calm, methodical way that I answered as clearly as I could while some separate part of me floated slightly outside my own body and watched. When did we move in? Had we had any previous incidents? Was anything missing from the house to our knowledge? Had we noticed any signs of entry, broken windows, damaged locks, anything forced? I said I didn't think so. I said the locks had been rekeyed when we moved in. I said I didn't understand how he'd been getting in and out. She wrote things down and didn't tell me anything. After about 20 minutes, one of the other officers came to the front door and said they'd cleared the house. Nobody inside. I asked if they were sure. He said yes, and something in the way he said it, fully, without qualification, let me breathe for the first time since I'd put my hand on that sleeping bag. They let me back in after another 10 minutes. I went straight to the basement. The detective who'd arrived with the second car, a compact, deliberate woman named Vasquez, who spoke like someone who had learned to be economical with words because she'd seen too many situations where the wrong ones made things worse, was crouched at the half wall looking at the space behind the water heater. She glanced up when I came down the stairs and didn't tell me to leave, which I took as permission to stay. "How long do you think he was down here?" I asked. She looked at the items still arranged behind the water heater, the sleeping bag, the backpack, the book, the charging cable. "Based on what we're seeing," she said carefully, "it looks like this setup has been here for a while." A pause. "The dust patterns around the sleeping bag suggest it's been in this position for weeks, possibly since shortly after you moved in." I heard myself say something, I'm not sure what. "We moved in at the end of July," I said when I'd reorganized enough to form a sentence. She nodded once, writing, "Since July." We'd been in the house since the end of July, and it was now the last week of October. Nearly 3 months. Nearly 3 months of someone sleeping in our basement, eating our food, moving through our house in the hours we weren't alert to it, and going up to the second floor. I understood now with a cold and specific clarity to stand in my daughter's room and look at her while she slept. Nora had told me on her first mention of him that he stood by the window that looked out over the side yard and the fence, which meant he wasn't coming to look out. He was standing where he could be seen from the bed. Whether that was carelessness or something else entirely, I still don't let myself think about for too long. The entry point, when Vasquez found it, was almost elegant in its simplicity. A basement window on the side of the house, small, ground level, the kind with the old single latch hardware that had probably been installed in the 1970s and never upgraded. The latch had been manipulated from outside, the mechanism worn enough that it could be slid open with a thin implement without leaving obvious marks. He'd been coming and going through that window, closing it behind him each time, the whole system so low disturbance that our rekeyed deadbolts had never mattered at all. He'd been in the house before we changed the locks, might have been watching the house before we moved in, might have identified the window then. Vasquez didn't speculate out loud, but I could see the shape of it, the neighborhood, the quiet street, the house sitting empty for a few weeks between owners. Someone who'd had time to find the soft point of entry and establish themselves before we arrived with our boxes and our daughter and our cat, who immediately knew something was wrong and could not make us understand. I thought about Biscuit sitting in the hallway for 40 minutes with that sound she'd never made before, and I felt something toward her that I can only describe as a debt. Adele came back from the Pattersons while Vasquez was still processing the basement. She came downstairs and stood beside me and looked at the space behind the water heater and was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and took my hand without looking at me, and we stood there like that while the detective moved carefully around our basement doing her work. He was gone. He'd left before we called the police, possibly heard us on the stairs, possibly had some system for knowing when to go. The window latch, when they examined it, could be operated from outside in under 30 seconds. He'd had practice. He was fast. The backpack he left behind, the sleeping bag, the book, a worn paperback thriller, the kind you pick up secondhand, no name written inside, the charging cable, the water bottle, everything except himself. And a set of muddy boot prints, Vasquez pointed out quietly, that went from the window to the stairs and back. Measured, even spaced. Someone who had made this walk many times and knew exactly how to do it in the dark without making a sound. They found him 6 days later. His name was Warren Grell, 41, no fixed address. Hadn't had one, the detective told us, for the better part of 3 years. He'd been living this way, she said, moving between vacant properties and occupied ones, identifying soft entry points, establishing himself quietly in spaces people didn't check. There had been 2 prior incidents in other counties, neither of which had resulted in charges that stuck. One homeowner who hadn't pressed the case, one situation where he'd vacated before anything could be confirmed and the evidence hadn't been enough. He was practiced at it. He knew how much presence he could maintain without tipping into visibility. He'd been doing it long enough that it had become a kind of expertise. Vasquez told us this at our kitchen table on a gray November morning, Adele and I on one side, her notes on the other. She delivered the information with the same careful economy she'd used in the basement, watching us absorb it piece by piece, pausing when she needed to. I remember being grateful for that, for being given each thing separately rather than all at once. He'd identified the house during the vacancy between owners, had been inside before we moved in, before the locksmith, before the rekeyed deadbolts, before any of it. The window latch in the basement had been his, in a sense, long before the house was ours. We'd inherited his entry point, along with the hardwood floors and the oak tree and the water heater that was apparently our responsibility now. What he'd been doing in the house during the 3 months he was down there, where he went, what he accessed, how far through the rooms he moved on any given night, was not something Vasquez could tell us with complete certainty, and I understood, from the careful way she framed that uncertainty, that some of it she probably could tell us and was choosing not to. I've made peace with not knowing all of it, or I've made something that functions like peace when I don't press it too hard. What I know, Nora was never physically harmed. What I know, the boot prints from the window to the stairs and back suggested the basement was his primary territory. What I know, there is a difference between what I know and what I think about at 3 a.m. sometimes, and I've learned to manage that distance carefully. We had the basement window replaced with a sealed unit the same week. Had every window in the house inspected, every latch assessed, every point of entry evaluated by someone who understood what they were looking for in a way we hadn't when we moved in. We had a security system installed, cameras at all exterior doors, a monitoring service, contacts who would be notified if anything triggered after hours. The house on Clement Drive grew more locks the way a wound grows scar tissue, quietly and permanently. We stayed. I want to be clear about that because people always ask, and the asking carries an implication that leaving would have been the more rational choice. Maybe it was. But we'd saved for 6 years for that house, had Nora's drawings on the walls and her soccer gear in the hallway, and the cat's established territories distributed through every room, and leaving felt like letting something be taken from us that we'd already fought hard enough to have. We stayed, and we hardened the house, and we learned to live in it again, which took longer than I expected, and went in a non-linear direction that I won't pretend was easy. Nora doesn't remember the details. She was 5, and 5-year-olds don't retain the architecture of events the way adults do. They keep the feeling of things, the texture, not the sequence. She knows we had a man in the house who wasn't supposed to be there because we told her a version of it that was honest without being more than she could hold. She seemed, at the time, more relieved than frightened, like something she'd been trying to tell us had finally been understood. She's 8 now. She still sleeps in the same room, chose to keep it, same as she'd chosen it over the bigger one, with the same private logic that governs everything she decides. She doesn't talk about the man. The drawing she made in October, the one with the figure in the upstairs window, got lost in the move to the new filing system Adele set up after everything happened. I didn't look for it. The thing I come back to, the thing I carry in a specific pocket of my thinking that I open sometimes when I'm in the right frame of mind to handle it, is the question of what would have happened if Nora hadn't said anything, if she'd been older or less straightforward, or had decided the man was a secret worth keeping, if we'd gone on through winter the way we'd been going through autumn, rationalizing the fruit and the smell and the door, letting biscuits 40 minutes in the hallway become just another piece of the house's personality. If we'd never had the second conversation, never seen the drawing, never laid the pieces side by side and finally looked at what they made. He was warm in that sleeping bag the morning we found him. Within the hour, I still think, maybe less. The distance between that warmth and my daughter's bedroom was 11 steps. I've walked it. I know. Trust what your children tell you. Trust what your animals tell you. Trust the fruit bowl and the smell and the door that keeps being open when you were certain you closed it. And check behind the water heater. Every house has a place nobody thinks to look. Find yours before someone else does. My barber asked about the scar on the back of my head. I didn't know I had one. Marcus had been cutting my hair for 6 years, not a salon, a proper old-school barbershop on Delancey Street with 4 chairs and a checkerboard floor and a television mounted in the corner that was always showing either sports highlights or local news, and sometimes both at once on a split screen that nobody had ever asked for. I'd found it by accident when I was 22, new to the city, walking past on a Saturday morning when the place was half full and something about it looked like it knew what it was doing. Marcus had been the one who waved me into his chair, and I'd never sat in anyone else's since. There's a particular kind of trust that develops between a person and their barber. It's not friendship exactly, it's something more transactional, but also strangely intimate, built on proximity and repetition, and the specific vulnerability of sitting still while someone moves around your head with sharp things. I knew Marcus had 2 daughters, that he'd grown up in the Bronx, that he had opinions about the Yankees that bordered on the theological. He knew I'd changed jobs twice, that I'd been in a long relationship that ended badly, that I took my coffee black and bought it from the place 2 doors down before my appointments. We knew each other the way people know each other when they've been sharing the same hour every 3 weeks for 6 years. I was 28 when this happened. It was a Tuesday in late October, slow afternoon. Only one other customer in the shop, and he was already done and half asleep under a hot towel in the far chair. The rain was going outside, steady and gray against the front window, the television showing a weather map that confirmed what we could all already see. Marcus was working on the back of my neck with the trimmer, doing the detail work he was meticulous about, and I had my eyes closed the way you do when someone is being careful around your ears. He stopped, not a pause. A full stop, the trimmer going quiet, one of those silences that has a texture to it that a normal silence doesn't. "Hey," he said, "how long have you had this?" I opened my eyes. The mirror showed me my own face looking mildly curious. "Had what?" "This scar. Back here." He touched something at the base of my skull. Not the very base, but high on the neck, where the hairline met the occipital bone, a place I had never once in my life had reason to look at directly. A light, precise touch, 2 fingers. "Right here. It's a good one." I held very still. "What does it look like?" "Like a healed incision, maybe 2 inches, running horizontal. Old. It's fully closed, faded, but there's some raised tissue. Whoever closed it did a clean job." He said it the way he said things about hairlines or cowlicks. Matter of fact, something he'd simply noticed because he was in the business of noticing things at close range on the backs of people's heads. He tilted my head forward gently and held his phone up to take a photo so I could see it, which was a thing he did sometimes when customers wanted to check the fade before he called it done. He showed me the screen. I looked at it for a long moment without speaking. 2 inches, he'd said. That was accurate, horizontal, sitting at the base of my skull just above where the neck began, a pale seam in the skin that had the flat, finished look of something that had healed completely and done so some time ago. The hair around it had grown back fully. If you didn't know to look, you wouldn't see it. If Marcus hadn't been doing the detail work on my neck with the trimmer, if the light hadn't been catching it at that angle, we'd have finished the appointment, and I'd have walked out onto Delancey Street and gone the rest of my life not knowing it was there. "I don't know," I said. Marcus looked at me in the mirror. "You don't know how long you've had it?" "I don't know that I have it." I paused. "I mean, I didn't know. I've never seen it before." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this with the measured expression of a man who had seen enough in 6 years of standing behind people's heads to not be easily surprised. "You ever have any kind of procedure back there? Surgery, anything?" "No." "Fall? Accident?" "Not that I know of." He handed me the phone again, and I looked at the photo for a second time. The scar was undeniable. Not a scratch, not a mark. Not something ambiguous that could be mistaken for a skin irregularity. A healed incision. Deliberate even. The kind that came from something with an edge that knew where it was going. I paid for my haircut. I tipped Marcus the way I always did, and told him I'd see him in 3 weeks, and walked out into the rain on Delancey Street and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. People moving around me with their umbrellas, the city going about its Tuesday afternoon entirely indifferent to the fact that I had just discovered a scar on my own head that I could not explain. I called my mother from the corner. She answered on the 3rd ring, warm and slightly distracted the way she usually was in the afternoons, and I asked her, trying to keep my voice neutral, trying to phrase it in a way that wasn't immediately alarming, whether I'd had any kind of head injury or surgery when I was young. Something at the base of the skull, anything that would leave a mark. The line was quiet for long enough that I pulled the phone from my ear to check the connection. "Mom." "Why are you asking?" she said. Her voice had changed, not dramatically, just enough. The warmth still there, but something underneath it that hadn't been there 10 seconds ago. Something careful. "My barber found a scar," I said. "I've never seen it before. I don't know what it's from." Another silence. Shorter this time, but I felt it. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said. "You probably bumped your head when you were little. You were always climbing things." "This doesn't look like a bump," I said. "It looks like a cut, a clean one." "Owen." My name, in the specific tone of voice she used when she was done with a conversation. "I'm sure it's nothing. You should get it looked at if you're worried, but I'm sure it's nothing." We talked for 2 more minutes about things that weren't the scar, and then she said she had to go, and we hung up, and I stood on the corner in the rain and understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes from a conversation rather than a confrontation, that my mother knew exactly what that scar was, and had just decided not to tell me. I didn't call her back that night. I wanted to, sat with my phone on the kitchen table for most of the evening, turning the conversation over, building the version of the call where I pushed harder, and she explained it, and it turned out to be something ordinary and embarrassing that she'd simply forgotten to mention. A childhood fall, a small procedure, routine, the kind of thing parents normalize and kids don't remember. I built that version carefully and completely, and I almost believed it. And then I'd remember the quality of the silence before "I'm sure it's nothing," the specific weight of it, and the whole construction would come apart. My mother was not a woman who paused before answering questions about childhood injuries. She was the kind of mother who could tell you the date, time, and precise circumstances of every scrape and stitch and stomach bug I'd had before the age of 10. She kept a folder, an actual paper folder, in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, with my vaccination records and a pediatric growth chart and a card from the dentist who'd pulled my first molar. The idea that she'd forgotten a surgical incision at the base of my skull was not something I could make myself believe. I looked at the photo on my phone for a long time that night. Marcus had texted it to me after I'd left. Just the image, no message, which was exactly right. I zoomed in on it and examined the scar from every angle the resolution would allow. 2 inches, horizontal, pale and flat, and thoroughly healed. I tried to recall every head injury I'd ever had: a bike fall at 10 that split my chin, a door handle to the temple at 16, a minor concussion in my mid-20s from a weekend basketball game that had ended badly. None of them were at the base of my skull. None of them had required anything close to what the photo showed. I made an appointment with my GP the next morning. Dr. Feynman had been my doctor since I'd moved to the city, a small, precise woman who had the rare quality of taking what you said at face value before deciding what to do with it. I got her first available slot, which was Thursday afternoon, and spent the intervening 36 hours trying to behave normally. I went to work. I answered emails. I had a conversation with a colleague about a project deadline that I have absolutely no memory of the content of. I ate dinner without tasting it. Thursday came. Dr. Feynman examined the scar with a small light and a magnifier, and said nothing for a while in the focused way she had when she was doing the thing where she looked before she spoke. When she straightened up, her expression was carefully neutral. "How long have you known about this?" she asked. "Since Tuesday. My barber found it." She wrote something down. "And before Tuesday, you had no awareness of it at all?" "None." "Any history of neurological symptoms, headaches, vision disturbances, memory gaps, anything that presented unexpectedly?" I started to say no, and then stopped. There was something minor, The kind of thing you don't think to connect to anything because it seems too small and too ordinary. Headaches. Yes, but everyone had headaches. What gave me pause was the memory gaps she'd mentioned. Not significant ones, nothing that had alarmed me, but a handful of times over the past couple of years when I'd arrived somewhere with a vague, unspecific sense of having lost time I couldn't quite account for. 20 minutes, an hour, waking on a weekend morning with Saturday already half gone and no clear recollection of how I'd spent the early part of it. I'd attributed it to stress, to not sleeping well, to the accumulated fog of living alone in a city at a pace that didn't always leave room for proper rest. I told Dr. Feynman about the gaps. She wrote more down. Then she sat back and looked at me with the particular expression of a doctor who has formed an initial opinion and is deciding how much of it to share at this stage. "I want to refer you for imaging," she said. "An MRI. I want to see what's happening structurally at the site of the scar before we draw any conclusions." "What kind of conclusions are we avoiding drawing?" She gave me a small, measured smile. "The kind that are better made with information than without it." Then, because she was good at her job and understood that this was not reassuring, a healed incision in that location in an otherwise healthy adult male with no memory of the injury that caused it is unusual enough that I want to understand it before I speculate. That's all. The MRI was scheduled for the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Marcus's trimmer had gone quiet. I called my father that evening. Not my mother. My father, which was a distinction I'd been thinking about all week. My parents had been married for 31 years and shared most things between them the way long marriages do, but they were distinct people with distinct ways of occupying difficult conversations. My mother closed them. My father, quieter, more interior, the kind of man who thought before he spoke and meant what he said, left them open. He answered on the second ring. "Dad," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." A pause, briefer than my mother's had been. "But there." "All right," he said. "The scar on the back of my head. Do you know what it's from?" The silence this time was longer than either of his that had come before. Long enough that I stood up from the kitchen table without meaning to, as though my body needed to be upright for whatever was coming. "Owen," he said finally. His voice was careful and heavy in equal measure, the voice of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just been asked to set it down. "That's a conversation we should have in person." My stomach turned over slowly. "How long has it been a conversation?" I asked. He didn't answer that. He said he'd come to the city on Saturday, that we'd get dinner, that he'd tell me what he could. What he could, not what he knew, not everything, but what he could. I noted the distinction and chose not to push it, because some part of me understood that whatever was at the end of this was going to change something, and I wanted 2 more days of not knowing it yet. We hung up, and I sat back down at the kitchen table and put my phone face down on the wood and sat in the quiet of my apartment for a long time. What he could. What a careful and terrible phrase that was. My father arrived Saturday at 6. I watched him come up the street from my apartment window, a compact, deliberate man in a dark coat, moving the way he always moved, neither fast nor slow, conserving energy the way people do who have spent long careers on their feet. He was 63 and looked it in the good way, the way that means a person has inhabited their life fully rather than been worn down by it. I buzzed him up and met him at the door, and we did the thing we always did, the handshake that became a brief embrace, one hand on the shoulder, the specific economy of affection between fathers and adult sons who love each other and are not especially demonstrative about it. He looked at me in the way he had sometimes, a long, quiet appraisal, the kind that had always meant he was checking something only he knew to look for. I'd noticed it my whole life without ever thinking to ask what he was looking for. I thought about that standing in my own doorway. We went to the Italian place around the corner that I'd been going to since I moved to the neighborhood. Red-checked tablecloths, wine by the carafe, the kind of place where the noise level meant you could talk without being overheard. I'd chosen it deliberately. We ordered. We talked about surface things while the food came. His drive down, my mother's garden, a mutual cousin's recent engagement. My father ate methodically and didn't rush any of it, and I followed his lead because I'd learned years ago that pushing him produced less than waiting did. He would get there. He always got there. The plates were cleared. He poured the last of the carafe into both glasses and set it aside and folded his hands on the table in the way he did when he'd decided to begin. "When you were 4 years old," he said, "you had a seizure." I said nothing, waited. "A severe one. You were at your grandmother's house, your mother's mother, this was before she passed, and you just went down in the backyard. No warning. We were inside. Your grandmother found you." He kept his eyes on the table in the careful way of a person reciting something they've rehearsed the words for, but not the emotion. "We took you to the hospital. They ran every test they had, and they found something." The restaurant noise continued around us, ordinary and indifferent. "A cyst," he said, "small, sitting at the base of the skull, pressing on the brain stem. The neurologist said it had probably been there since birth, developing slowly, and that the seizure was the first sign it had reached a size that was causing problems." He paused. "They said if we left it, you'd have more seizures, that the pressure would increase, that the outcomes further down that road were not ones they wanted to describe to us." "They operated," I said. "Yes." "When I was 4. "Yes. It took about 3 hours. The surgeon she was excellent, very experienced. She removed the cyst completely and closed the site, and you recovered in about 2 weeks, and then you were fine." He said it the way people say things they've needed to believe for a very long time. Completely fine. Normal development, normal everything. The follow-up scans were clean for 3 years running, and by the time you were 8, the neurologist said the likelihood of recurrence was negligible. We were told we could, as she put it, let you grow up without this being something that defined your childhood. I turned my wine glass slowly on the tablecloth. "So you didn't tell me." "We didn't tell you." "For 24 years. He held my gaze for the first time since he'd started talking. "Yes." I sat with that for a moment. The anger was there. I could feel it, a clean, even heat. But underneath it was something more complicated, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, and didn't have a name I knew. 24 years. The whole architecture of my own medical history, built on a foundation I hadn't known existed. Every time I'd filled out a form in a doctor's office and written no in the box marked prior surgeries. Every time I'd answered questions about my health history and given answers that were, without my knowing it, incomplete. "The memory gaps," I said. I told Dr. Feynman about them. Something moved across my father's face. He picked up his wine glass and set it down without drinking from it. "What memory gaps?" I told him about them. The scattered instances over the past couple of years. Nothing dramatic. The occasional morning or afternoon that felt unaccounted for. I watched his face carefully as I talked, and what I saw there was not the reassurance I'd been hoping for. What I saw was a man who was running a rapid internal calculation and not liking where it was landing. "You haven't had those before," he said. It was not quite a question. "Not that I noticed. Maybe in the last 2 years. Why?" He was quiet for long enough that I knew the answer wasn't going to be simple. "The neurologist said something when you were discharged," he said slowly. "About the location of the cyst. She said that the brainstem region, that particular area, was involved in certain regulatory functions, sleep, memory consolidation, that kind of thing. She said the surgery had been clean and complete, that there was no reason to expect any lasting effects." He paused. But she also said that if we ever noticed anything unusual in those areas as you got older, we should bring you back in. And you never brought me back in. You never showed any signs. Until now. He didn't answer that. He looked at the tablecloth and then at me and then at something past my shoulder with the expression of a man who had believed for 24 years that a decision he'd made from love had been the right one and was sitting across from his adult son in a restaurant confronting the possibility that it had simply been the easier one. I didn't tell him that Dr. Feynman had already ordered an MRI. I didn't want to watch his face while he processed that. I paid the bill over his objection, and we walked back to my building in the cold. And at the door, he held both of my shoulders and looked at me for a long moment in the specific way he'd been looking at me my whole life. Checking something only he knew to look for. I understood now what it was. I went upstairs and sat on my couch in the dark for a while without turning on any lights, and I thought about a 4-year-old boy going down in a backyard and a grandmother finding him, and a surgeon spending 3 hours at the base of a small skull, and 2 parents deciding on a version of a childhood that didn't include any of it. I thought about what negligible meant, whether it meant 0, whether there was a difference. I thought about the gaps, and then I picked up my phone and called Dr. Feynman's after-hours line and left a message asking whether we could move the MRI to the earliest possible date, and whether she could tell me, before I came in, exactly what she was looking for. She called back Monday morning before I'd finished my first coffee. Dr. Feynman didn't do reassurance for its own sake. It was one of the things I'd always valued about her. So when she said she'd managed to get me a cancellation slot for Wednesday at 7 a.m. at the Imaging Center on West 34th, I understood without being told that she'd put some effort into making that happen. She also answered my second question, the one about what she was looking for, in the careful, precise way she had of giving you information without giving you room to catastrophize it prematurely. She said she wanted to look at the surgical site for any changes in the surrounding tissue. She said she wanted to check for any new growth in the region where the cyst had been removed. She said the memory gaps I'd described were consistent with several things, most of them minor, and that imaging would help her rule out the ones that weren't. Rule out. I'd been a healthy person my entire adult life in the specific, unthinking way of someone who has never had real cause not to be. No chronic conditions, no medications, no history of anything that required management. I'd sat in Dr. Feynman's office for annual physicals and answered her questions with the easy brevity of someone for whom the answers were all uniformly fine, and she'd sent me away each time with a clean bill and a reminder about sunscreen. This was the first time I'd ever sat with the particular anxiety of waiting for results that might not be fine, and I want to be honest about what that felt like. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a low, persistent hum behind everything, a frequency that made the ordinary texture of the next 2 days feel slightly unreal. I went to work. I cooked dinner. I called my father once, briefly, to tell him the appointment was scheduled, and heard in his voice the same low hum at a different pitch. Wednesday morning, I was at the imaging center at 6:50. The MRI itself was 45 minutes, a narrow tube, a specific mechanical clanking that the technician had warned me about, the instruction to hold completely still that becomes the only thing you're aware of when you've been told to do it. I'd been given foam earplugs against the noise, but they helped only partially, and I lay there in the machine listening to it knock and whir and clank around my skull and thought about a 4-year-old in a backyard and tried to keep my breathing even. I left the imaging center at 8:15. Dr. Feynman said she'd have the radiologist's report by end of day Thursday and would call me herself. She called Thursday at 4:17 p.m. Owen. Her voice was the measured, careful version, not the brisk efficiency of a normal appointment call, but something more deliberate. I was sitting at my desk at work, and I got up immediately and walked to the stairwell where it was quiet, because I needed to hear her without the ambient noise of the office. The imaging came back, she said. I want you to come in tomorrow morning so we can talk through it properly. But I also don't want you to spend tonight not knowing anything. So I'm going to give you the broad picture now, and we'll go through the detail in person. Okay, I said. My voice was steady. I was standing on the landing between the fourth and fifth floors, and the stairwell was empty, and my hand on the railing was completely still. The surgical site looks clean. No recurrence at the original location, no new growth. The tissue is exactly what we'd expect to see from a well-healed procedure of that type. A pause. But the radiologist flagged something else. There's an anomaly in the tissue approximately 2 centimeters from the original site. It's small. The radiologist's word was incidental, meaning it presented without symptoms that would typically prompt imaging in a routine context. But in light of your history and the gaps you described, he wanted to note it. The stairwell was very quiet. What kind of anomaly? I asked. That's what I'd like to discuss in person, with the images in front of us. She said it without evasion, just precision, the recognition that this was a conversation that needed to happen with full information rather than over a phone in a stairwell. What I can tell you is that it isn't an emergency. You don't need to go anywhere tonight, but I do want to see you tomorrow. I was at her office at 8 a.m. Friday. She had the images up on a screen when I came in. The gray and white topography of the inside of my own skull, cross-sectioned and labeled, strange and intimate in equal measure. She walked me through the surgical site first, pointing out the clean margins, the healed tissue, the absence of anything that shouldn't be there. Then she moved the cursor 2 centimeters to the right of it and stopped. "There," she said. Small. She hadn't been understating it. It was genuinely small, a density in the tissue that the untrained eye might have passed over entirely. But the radiologist had circled it in the report, and Dr. Feynman had her own cursor on it now, and it was there with the undeniable fairness of something that had been found. "What is it?" I said. "We don't know yet with certainty. That's the honest answer." She turned from the screen and looked at me directly. It could be scar tissue from the original procedure, a late-forming adhesion, something entirely benign. The radiologist noted that the location and density are consistent with that explanation. She paused. But the location is also in a region involved in memory consolidation, specifically the kind of episodic memory formation that affects how we encode and retain recent experience. I looked at the circled density on the screen. 2 centimeters from where a surgeon had worked 24 years ago with me, too small to understand what was happening. 2 centimeters from the scar Marcus had found with his trimmer on a Tuesday afternoon in the rain. "The gaps," I said. "Possibly. We'd need a specialist to give you anything definitive. I'm referring you to a neurologist, and I want to get that appointment made today." She leaned forward slightly. "Owen, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. The gaps you described, have there been any instances where the lost time wasn't just a vague sense of missing hours? Any instances where you found evidence of something you'd done that you had no memory of doing?" The question landed with a weight I hadn't anticipated. I started to say no. It was the automatic answer, the one that came first because it was the comfortable one, the one that meant the world stayed the size it currently was. And then I stopped, because there was something. Small, easily explained, the kind of thing that lives at the edge of ordinary life and never demands examination unless something makes you look directly at it. Twice in the past year, I'd woken up to find my front door unlocked when I was certain I'd locked it. Once I'd found my jacket on the couch instead of on its hook by the door, which was where I always put it, without exception. 3 weeks ago, I'd found mud on my shoes on a Tuesday morning when I had no memory of going anywhere the previous evening that would have involved mud. Tuesday, the day before Marcus's appointment, the day before any of this started. I told Dr. Feynman about the mud. She wrote it down, and her pen moved for slightly longer than the detail seemed to warrant. And when she looked up, her expression was the one she used when she was taking something seriously enough not to let her face show how seriously. "We're going to get you in front of a neurologist as soon as possible," she said. "This week if I can manage it." I nodded. I looked at the screen again, at the small circled density 2 centimeters from the place where someone had once repaired something in me that I'd had no knowledge of, and I thought about Tuesday evening, wherever I had gone, whatever I had done, the mud on my shoes the next morning, the only evidence that I had been anywhere at all. I didn't know where I'd been. I didn't know what I'd done. And I had no way of knowing how many other Tuesdays there had been. The neurologist's name was Dr. Osei. He was 50-ish, unhurried, with an office full of anatomical models and framed diplomas and the particular quality of stillness that certain specialists develop, the kind that communicates, without being said, that he had heard difficult things before and had not been undone by them. Dr. Feynman had gotten me in front of him by the following Monday, which I understood was a favor I owed her. He reviewed the MRI, reviewed the surgical records my parents had sent, a thick envelope my father had overnighted, the physical file they'd kept for 24 years in a cabinet in the spare bedroom alongside the vaccination records and the growth charts. And then he sat across from me and asked me to describe the gaps in as much detail as I could. I told him everything: the scattered mornings, the missing afternoons, the mud on the shoes. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment in the thoughtful rather than alarming way. What he told me took about 20 minutes, and I will try to condense it honestly. The anomaly on the scan was, in his assessment, almost certainly scar tissue. A late-forming adhesion from the original procedure, not uncommon in the region, not dangerous in itself. He said he'd seen similar presentations before, and that the tissue type and density were consistent with a benign explanation. He said he wanted to monitor it with annual imaging, and that if it remained stable, which he expected it to, there was no reason to anticipate any intervention. That was the good news, delivered first the way good news should be. The gaps were more complicated. The brainstem region, where the original cyst had sat, where the surgery had been performed, where the scar tissue had formed, was, as my father's neurologist had told my parents 24 years ago, involved in regulatory functions that included sleep architecture and certain aspects of memory formation. Dr. Osei explained it carefully, in plain language, the way a good doctor explains things to a non-specialist, that the brain's consolidation of experience during sleep, the process by which the events of a day are encoded into retrievable memory, ran through structures in that region. That disruption to those structures, whether from residual scar tissue, from minor pressure fluctuations, from any number of small variables, could, in some cases, produce gaps in encoding. Mornings where the previous evening hadn't properly transferred from short-term experience to long-term recall. Hours that had happened but hadn't been stored. I had gone places and done things on those evenings. I simply hadn't kept them. So where did I go? I asked. The mud, Tuesday night. That I can't tell you, Dr. Osei said. What I can tell you is that the behavior during those gaps is typically consistent with the person's normal patterns, habitual routes, familiar places, routine actions. The brain operating on something close to autopilot, without the layer of conscious encoding that produces retrievable memory. You likely went somewhere you'd been many times before and wouldn't have thought twice about. But I don't know which somewhere. No, he said, you don't. I sat with that. The idea that there was a version of me moving through the world on certain evenings, walking familiar streets, going through ordinary motions, existing in the city with full physical presence, that I had no access to. That this other me had been to places I couldn't name and come home with mud on his shoes and gone to bed and woken up the next morning as though none of it had happened. Because for the me who woke up, none of it had. It hadn't been stored. It was simply gone. Dr. Osei referred me to a sleep specialist and prescribed a medication to support sleep architecture, the underlying structure that influenced the encoding process. He said many people with similar presentations saw significant improvement with treatment. He said the word manageable several times in different contexts, and I understood that he meant it, and also that manageable was doing a specific kind of work in those sentences. Not cured, not resolved, but navigable, livable, a thing that could be accommodated. I left his office and stood on the sidewalk in the November air, which was cold and gray and smelled like the city, exhaust and rain-damp concrete, and the particular urban nothing of Midtown. I'd been inside for just over an hour. The world had continued without me in the way it always did, indifferent and complete, and I stood in it for a moment and thought about all the things I hadn't known about myself a week ago. I called Marcus that evening, not to explain everything. I didn't have the energy for everything, but to thank him. He answered in the background noise of the shop, end of the day sounds, and when I told him I'd seen a doctor and they'd found something that needed watching, he was quiet for a moment in the warm, uncomplicated way of someone who genuinely cared without needing details. "You good, though?" he said. "I think so," I said. "Yeah." "All right, then. See you in 3 weeks." That was Marcus. 6 years, and that was exactly right. I started the medication in December. The sleep specialist adjusted it twice in the first 2 months before we found the right calibration, and the gaps did not disappear immediately, but they became less frequent, and the ones that remained were shallower. Mornings where I had the impression of having done something ordinary the previous evening without the specifics, rather than the complete blankness of before. Dr. Osei called it progress. I called it learning to take inventory. I still don't know where I went on that Tuesday. I've made my peace with that, mostly. Dr. Osei's explanation, habitual route, familiar place, nothing out of the ordinary, is the most likely one, and I've chosen to let it be sufficient. The alternative is to spend whatever time I have left trying to reconstruct evenings that my own brain declined to record. And I've decided that's not a life I want to live. My parents came to the city in January. We had dinner, not the Italian place, somewhere new, somewhere without the weight of the conversation we'd already had in it. My mother held my hand across the table at one point without saying anything, and I let her, because whatever complicated thing I felt about the decision they'd made when I was 4 was not the whole of what I felt, and the whole of what I felt included being grateful for parents who had sat in a hospital with their 4-year-old and made the best decision they knew how to make with what they had. My father looked at me across the table in the way he always had, checking. This time, I looked back and let him see that I was okay, really okay. Not the automatic fine of someone managing a conversation, but the real version, as close to it as I could honestly claim. He nodded once, small, private, between us. The scar is still there, always will be. I know it's there now when I sit in Marcus's chair every 3 weeks and feel the trimmer do its careful work at the base of my skull. And I think sometimes about the version of me that walked into the barber shop on a Tuesday in October with no idea it existed. The gap between that version and this one, everything I know now that I didn't know then, is its own kind of scar, I suppose. Healed over, fully closed, but raised at the edges, permanent, mine. Something that had always been there, just waiting for the right person to find it.